Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. I always thought the house was just old. A creaky Victorian rental with peeling wallpaper, drafty windows, and a roof that complained every time it rained. It wasn't my dream home, but it was cheap and close to work. Plus, the landlord was a nice old woman who lived out of state, so I didn't have to worry about frequent inspections. I moved in without a second thought, happy to have a place to myself after years of roommates. It was quiet, almost too quiet sometimes, but I chalked that up to the neighborhood. There were only a few houses on the street, most of them dark and abandoned, the kind of place where people kept to themselves. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I'd settled into a routine: work, gym, home. I didn't go out much, preferring to spend my nights reading or watching TV in the cozy little living room. It wasn't until I started hearing the footsteps that I realized something was off. They were faint at first, like soft taps coming from the upstairs hallway. I figured it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind rattling the old wooden beams. But as the days went on, the footsteps grew louder. They always started around midnight, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth above me. It's probably just an animal, I told myself. A raccoon in the attic, or maybe squirrels nesting in the walls. But the noise was too rhythmic, too human. One night I mustered up the courage to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed up the narrow staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The upstairs was a mirror of the downstairs, long narrow hallways with doors leading to small dusty rooms. I stood there listening, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment everything was silent. Then I heard it again directly above me, like someone was pacing in the room at the end of the hall. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn around, but I pushed forward, my curiosity stronger than my fear. I opened the door to the room at the end of the hall and shined my flashlight inside. It was empty, just an old unused bedroom with a cracked window and faded wallpaper. I checked every corner, but there was nothing there. No animals, no sign of anyone having been there. Just dust and silence. The footsteps stopped after that, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself that old houses make weird noises. But then other things started happening. Small things at first. A door that I swore I'd closed would be open, or a light I'd turned off would be on. Once I came home to find all the kitchen cabinets wide open, like someone had gone through them in a hurry. I started feeling watched, like there were eyes on me whenever I moved through the house. I brushed it off as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being invaded. I even installed new locks, thinking maybe someone had a spare key, but nothing changed. The uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at me whenever I was alone. Then one night I woke up to the sound of something scraping against my bedroom door. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging against wood. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The scraping stopped, replaced by a soft shuffling, like bare feet moving away from my door and down the hall. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight feature to peer into the darkness. The hallway was empty, but the door to the attic at the end of the hall was slightly open. I'd never been up there. The landlord had mentioned it was just old storage, filled with dusty boxes and cobwebs. But now, staring at that dark opening, I felt a chill run down my spine. The next morning I called the landlord. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained that there might be animals in the attic, or maybe someone had broken in. She was quiet for a moment, then asked if I'd seen anything. When I told her about the footsteps and the scraping, she sighed. "I thought I told you," she said, her voice strained. "You're not supposed to go up there." I was taken aback. She had never mentioned anything about the attic being off limits. "Why not?" I asked, confused. She hesitated before answering. The last tenant. He spent a lot of time up there. After he passed, no one's been up there since. It's best to just leave it alone. The line went dead before I could ask any more questions. I felt a knot form in my stomach. What had she meant? Who was this last tenant? I tried to find out more, digging through old news articles and records, but I couldn't find anything specific about the house. Just vague stories of it being sold and resold, never staying with one owner for long. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling, listening for the footsteps. At exactly midnight, they started again, louder than ever, pacing back and forth, back and forth. I covered my ears, trying to drown it out, but the sound seemed to seep into my bones. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way to the attic door. If I was going to stay in this house, I needed to know what was up there. I pulled the door open, the hinges squealing in protest. A rickety wooden ladder led up into the darkness. I climbed up slowly, the ladder creaking under my weight. The attic was pitch black, the air thick with dust and the musty smell of old wood. I shined my flashlight around, revealing stacks of boxes, old furniture, and a small window at the far end, barely letting in any light. And then I saw it. In the corner, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was a man, or at least the shadow of one. He was tall, his features indistinct, shrouded in darkness. My heart stopped as the figure turned towards me, and for the first time I saw his eyes, deep, hollow pits that seemed to absorb all the light. "Get out," he rasped, his voice echoing in the cramped space. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the ladder, scrambling to get away. As I bolted down the stairs, I heard it again. Those footsteps, now thundering behind me, chasing me down. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house, my heart pounding in my ears. I drove away, not looking back, my mind racing with what I had seen. I didn't know what he was. A ghost, a shadow, a memory. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I moved out the next day, leaving behind most of my things. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I called her to break the lease. She just sighed, almost like she had been expecting it. A few weeks later, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a picture of the house, taken from the street. My old house, dark and empty. But there, in the attic window, I could see him, the shadow, watching. And then, beneath the photo, a message. "You're not supposed to leave." I never replied. I changed my number, moved to a different city, and tried to forget. But sometimes late at night I can still hear it. The soft, deliberate footsteps, always at midnight, always pacing, like he's still searching for something. Or maybe, just maybe, he's waiting for me to come back. I work the night shift as a taxi driver in a small, quiet town that comes alive only when the sun goes down. The nights are long, and most of my passengers are drunks, party-goers, or the occasional traveler passing through. It's a lonely job, but it pays the bills, and I've gotten used to the quiet. But there was one night, a night I'll never forget, that changed everything I thought I knew about fear. It was a typical Tuesday, and the town was dead. I was parked near the train station, scrolling through my phone, waiting for a fare. The clock on the dashboard showed 2:13 a.m. when the radio crackled, announcing the arrival of the last train. Normally, the last train only brought a handful of people, if any, so I wasn't expecting much. But I looked up, and that's when I saw him. He was standing under the flickering streetlight, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that seemed to swallow him whole. His face was obscured by the shadows, but something about him seemed off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like he didn't belong there, like he was out of place in the world. He didn't have any luggage, just stood there staring in my direction. I hesitated for a moment, but a fare was a fare. I flashed my lights and he walked over, his movements stiff and unnatural. He opened the door and slid into the back seat without saying a word. I glanced at him through the rear-view mirror, but he kept his head down, his face hidden under the brim of his hat. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he handed me a piece of paper with an address scribbled on it. I didn't recognize the location, but I typed it into my GPS and started driving. The address led to the outskirts of town, a place I rarely went, especially not at this hour. As I drove, the man didn't say a word, just sat there, unnervingly still. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. The further we drove, the darker it got. Streetlights became sparse, and soon we were on a narrow, winding road that cut through dense woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My palms were sweaty, and I kept glancing in the mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of his face, but he kept his head down, obscured by shadows. After about 20 minutes, the GPS indicated that we were close. The road narrowed even further, and thick fog rolled in, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, trying to find the turn. The address led to an old, dilapidated house hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and overgrown weeds choking the path to the front door. "We're here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned to look at him, but the back seat was empty. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't heard the door open or close. I looked around, panicking, but the man was gone. The only sign that he had ever been there was the faint indentation on the seat. I stepped out of the car, the fog wrapping around me like cold fingers. I walked to the back of the car, half expecting to see him standing there, but there was no one. I was about to get back in the car when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the ground, were wet footprints leading from the back seat to the house. They were fresh, but they didn't look right. They were too long, too narrow, like they didn't belong to a human. The air around me felt heavy, thick with a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. Against my better judgment, I followed the footprints. They led to the front door, which hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me, damp, musty, with an underlying stench of decay. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the cracks in the boarded windows. I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no answer. Just the silence, thick and suffocating. I should have left right then, but something compelled me to keep going. I walked through the house, my footsteps echoing on the rotting floorboards. The footprints continued, leading down a narrow hallway and stopping in front of a door at the end. I hesitated, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold, and as I turned it, a chill ran down my spine. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center was an old, dusty chair, and sitting in it was the man from the taxi. But something was wrong. His head was slumped forward, and as I stepped closer, I realized with horror that he wasn't breathing. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were open, staring blankly ahead, lifeless. I stumbled back, my heart racing. That's when I noticed the photos on the wall. Dozens of them, all black and white, faded with age. Each one showed the same man, wearing the same dark coat and hat, standing with different people. Some smiling, some serious, but all with the same vacant look in their eyes. And then I saw it. In the center of the wall was a photo of me, standing beside him in front of the taxi, just moments before I picked him up. My face was blank, my eyes dull and lifeless, just like his. I ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get out of that house. I sprinted to the car, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my ears. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and sped down the road without looking back. When I finally reached town, I parked under the bright lights of a 24-hour diner and tried to catch my breath. My hands were still trembling, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there, but the back seat was empty. I reached into my pocket for my phone to call someone, anyone, just to hear a familiar voice. But when I pulled it out, my heart sank. There, on the screen, was a new notification. A photo. I opened it with trembling fingers, and my blood turned to ice. It was another picture of me, sitting in the taxi, my face pale, my eyes wide with terror. And standing behind me, barely visible in the darkness, was the man, his cold, lifeless eyes staring directly into the camera. I never picked up another passenger after that night. I quit my job, moved to a different town, far away from Hollow Hill and that cursed house. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I still feel like I'm not. I catch glimpses of a shadow in the corner of my eye, or the faint sound of footsteps behind me. And every now and then, I get another photo on my phone. A reminder that once you've ridden with the last passenger, you're never truly alone again. And no matter how far I run, I know one day I'll see him again. I've always been a sucker for thrift shops. There's something about sifting through forgotten objects and finding hidden treasures that gives me a thrill. It's like each item has its own history, a story that's waiting to be discovered. That's how I ended up buying the mirror. It was tucked away in the back of the store, leaning against the wall, surrounded by dusty old furniture and knickknacks. It was tall, with an ornate wooden frame carved into intricate patterns that looked like twisted vines. The glass was slightly warped, like something out of an old funhouse, making reflections seem just a bit off. It was heavy and old, the kind of thing you'd imagine in a haunted mansion. I was drawn to it immediately. The shop owner was all too happy to let it go for cheap. He even helped me load it into my car, muttering something about it being one of those things that's better off out of sight. I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to add to the spooky vibe of his store. In hindsight, I wish I'd paid more attention. I set the mirror up in my living room right against the wall where it fit perfectly. It made the space feel bigger, and the odd reflections added a quirky charm that I thought was cool. But as the days went on, I started noticing things. At first, it was just little oddities. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, like a shadow passing behind me. I'd turn, expecting to see my cat or a reflection from outside, but there was never anything there. Sometimes when I looked into the mirror, it seemed like the room was just a fraction of a second behind me, like my reflection was a beat too slow. One night I was watching TV when I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror, just behind my couch, there was a figure standing in the hallway. It was so faint that at first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering TV screen. But as I stared, the figure became clearer. It was tall, with a gaunt frame and hollow eyes that seemed to bore into me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. My heart raced as I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. I laughed nervously, telling myself I was just tired, that it was a late-night hallucination. But deep down, I felt the icy grip of fear. From then on, the sightings became more frequent. The figure would appear at random times, sometimes just a vague silhouette, other times so clear that I could make out the sunken features of its face. It never moved, never made a sound, just stood there, watching. It always appeared in the reflection, never in the actual room. And every time I'd turn around, it would vanish, leaving me questioning my own sanity. One evening, I invited a friend over, hoping for some company to distract me. I hadn't told anyone about the mirror yet, afraid they'd think I was crazy. We were chatting, drinking wine, when she suddenly went pale, her eyes fixed on the mirror. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the mirror, there was someone—" I cut her off, forcing a laugh. "It's just a trick of the light. This old mirror does weird things sometimes." She didn't seem convinced, but she nodded, clearly unsettled. We ended the night early, and as soon as she left, I felt the weight of the empty house pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figure in the mirror was still there, lurking just out of sight. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint whispers like the rustling of dry leaves coming from the living room. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to get up. Eventually, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I got up, heart pounding, and crept into the living room. The mirror loomed in the darkness, its surface catching the faint glow of the streetlight outside. I approached it slowly, feeling like I was being pulled toward it against my will. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and strange, but otherwise normal. Then, as I watched, the figure appeared again, this time standing right behind my reflection. It was clearer than ever before, its face twisted into a grotesque smile. I spun around, expecting to see it standing there in the room with me, but there was nothing. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. But something was different. My reflection, it wasn't quite right. It stared back at me, eyes slightly too wide, mouth twitching at the corners. I moved my hand, and my reflection was just a fraction too slow to follow. It felt like looking at a stranger who was trying too hard to mimic me. A shiver ran down my spine, and I reached out to touch the mirror, half expecting my hand to go through it. The glass was cold and solid under my fingers. I stared into my own eyes, trying to shake off the feeling of wrongness, but the reflection didn't quite match my movements. I pulled back, my heart racing, and turned away. That's when I heard the whisper, clear as day. "Let me in." I whipped around, but the mirror was just a mirror reflecting the empty room behind me. I backed away, feeling the walls closing in. I didn't know what to do. Throw it out, smash it, burn it. None of it felt like it would be enough. The next day, I called the thrift shop, but the number was disconnected. I drove by, hoping to find the owner and ask where the mirror had come from. But the shop was closed, the windows boarded up as if it had been abandoned for years. There was no trace of the friendly old man who'd sold me the mirror, no sign that the shop had ever been open. I haven't seen the figure since, but the mirror is still in my house. I tried to get rid of it, but every time I work up the nerve to drag it outside, I find myself hesitating, like something is stopping me. It's as if the mirror wants to stay, wants me to keep looking into it. And every now and then, when I catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see it move on its own. Just a twitch, a flicker, like it's waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting for the right moment. Sometimes I hear the whispers late at night just as I'm drifting off to sleep. They're faint, like they're coming from far away, but they're always the same. Let me in. I don't know what's in that mirror or why it chose me, but I do know one thing. It's still there, watching, waiting. And every day I feel it getting closer, feel the pull growing stronger. I'm afraid that one day when I look into the mirror I won't see myself anymore. I'll see it. And worse, I'm afraid I'll want to let it in. I moved into my new apartment last fall, a small but cozy place in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was cheap, the location was convenient, and the building was old but well maintained. It seemed perfect, exactly what I needed after my recent breakup and the stress of starting a new job. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to put the past behind me and finally get my life together. The apartment had a few quirks, as old places do. The pipes groaned, the floorboards creaked, and sometimes the lights flickered. None of it bothered me. But the one thing that did catch my attention was the large antique mirror in the hallway. It was tall, almost touching the ceiling, with an ornate, tarnished frame that looked like it had seen better days. It was the kind of mirror you'd expect to find in a museum or a creepy old mansion, not a small city apartment. The landlord said it had been there as long as he could remember, too heavy and awkward to move, so the previous tenants just left it. I didn't mind. I've never been superstitious, and besides, I kind of liked the way it made the narrow hallway look a little bigger. But from the very first night, I felt strange about it. It started small. When I walked past the mirror, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. just a flicker, like someone was standing behind me. But when I turned, there was never anything there. I blamed it on my imagination or the play of light from the street outside. I was tired, adjusting to the new place, and figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the days went on, things got weirder. Sometimes, when I looked into the mirror, I'd see something that didn't quite match the rest of the reflection. A chair slightly out of place, the reflection of a light that wasn't actually on, or a shadow that didn't belong. Little things that I could easily explain away, but that left me feeling uneasy nonetheless. One night I came home late from work, exhausted and just wanting to collapse into bed. I tossed my keys onto the table and glanced at the mirror as I passed by. That's when I saw it. My reflection wasn't moving. I froze, staring at the mirror, my heart pounding. I raised my hand slowly, and after a delay that felt like an eternity, my reflection did the same. It moved just a split second behind me, like a poorly synced video. I blinked, and it was back to normal, my reflection moving perfectly in time. I told myself it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, I started to avoid the mirror. I couldn't explain it, but every time I looked into it, I felt like I was being watched, like the reflection wasn't just a reflection. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. I had enough on my plate with work and trying to adjust to my new life. I didn't need to add ghostly mirrors to the mix. Then, one night, everything changed. I woke up around 3 a.m., a time that always seems to be associated with the supernatural. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the building settling. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door. I sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the hallway, near the mirror. I got out of bed, my heart racing, and slowly made my way down the hall. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, and I realized it wasn't coming from the door or the walls. It was coming from inside the mirror. I stopped in front of it, staring at my reflection. Everything seemed normal, but the tapping persisted, louder now, more insistent. I reached out and touched the mirror's surface, expecting it to be cold and smooth, but it felt warm, almost pulsing under my fingers. I yanked my hand back, my pulse quickening. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. I backed away, suddenly terrified, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the glass. And then my reflection smiled. Not a normal smile, but a slow, twisted grin that spread across its face like a crack in a mask. I stood there, frozen, as my reflection began to move on its own, lifting its hand to the glass and pressing against it from the inside. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and I stumbled back, horrified. My reflection leaned closer, pressing its face against the glass, its eyes staring directly into mine. Then it spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was mine, but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. I bolted back to my bedroom, slammed the door shut, and curled up under the covers, my mind racing. I lay there for hours, wide awake, too scared to move until the first light of dawn finally crept through the window. I called in sick to work and spent the entire day trying to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare. But I knew it wasn't. I could still feel the warmth of the mirror on my fingertips, and those words echoed in my mind. The next day I called a few moving companies to get a quote on taking the mirror out. Each one refused. The mirror was too large, too fragile, too risky. I tried to cover it up, draping a sheet over it, but it always seemed to slip off, revealing that dark glass and the sense of eyes watching me. I considered smashing it, but something told me that would only make things worse. Then things started happening even when I wasn't near the mirror. Objects in my apartment would move when I wasn't looking. Doors would be ajar that I knew I had closed, and lights would flicker even when they'd been fine moments before. And I kept hearing that tapping, faint but persistent, no matter where I was. One night, after weeks of sleeplessness and mounting dread, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox, marched to the hallway, and stood in front of the mirror. My reflection stared back, perfectly normal, but I could feel the wrongness in the air, like the tension before a storm. I raised the hammer, ready to smash the glass, but something stopped me. In the reflection, I saw movement behind me, a shadow creeping closer, and the familiar shape of a person stepping into view. It was me, but not the me holding the hammer. The other me, the one in the mirror. The reflection smiled that same twisted grin, and before I could react, it reached out, grabbing my arm. I felt a pull, a force dragging me toward the mirror. I struggled, tried to wrench free, but it was like being caught in quicksand. My reflection's grip tightened, and the glass rippled again, drawing me in. I screamed, but no sound came out. Everything around me twisted, distorted, and the last thing I saw was the reflection stepping out of the mirror, taking my place. I blacked out. When I came to, I was lying on the floor in the hallway. The hammer was gone, and the mirror stood before me, undisturbed. I staggered to my feet, disoriented, and looked around. Everything seemed normal, but it felt different. Off. I glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see that other me staring back, but it was just my reflection, looking as terrified as I felt. But then, as I moved, I realized something chilling. The reflection wasn't following my movements perfectly. It was a second too slow, mimicking me like it was mocking me. I stepped back, and the reflection stepped forward, reaching out as if to touch the glass from the inside. I turned and ran, grabbing my phone and keys, and left the apartment without looking back. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I didn't care about the rent or the deposit. I just needed to get away. I found a new place across town in a building with no mirrors, not even in the bathroom. I thought I was safe, but sometimes when I pass by shop windows or catch my reflection in a puddle, I swear I see it. A slight delay, a flicker of movement that's not quite right. And every time, my reflection wears that same twisted smile, as if it's waiting for something. Because the truth is, I don't know if I ever really got out, or if the thing that came out of the mirror is still out there, living my life. And one day, it might decide that it wants it back. I never believed in ghosts. Growing up, I was the kid who'd roll his eyes at horror movies, dismiss urban legends, and mock friends who got scared at sleepovers. I prided myself on my skepticism, and as an adult, that attitude stayed with me. I became a night security guard at an old office building downtown, a job that fit my nocturnal nature and disdain for the supernatural perfectly. Or so I thought. The building I worked at wasn't particularly old, but it had a reputation among the guards. People said it was haunted, but I brushed it off as silly rumors. They said strange things happened on the 13th floor, the kind of stuff you'd hear around campfires, lights flickering, phones ringing with no one on the other end, shadows moving when they shouldn't. None of it fazed me, at least not until I got assigned to the 13th floor. It was a quiet night, as most nights were, the kind where the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of city traffic are the only things keeping you company. My rounds were almost done when I reached the elevator. The doors opened with a soft ding, and I stepped inside, hitting the button for the 13th floor. The ride up was smooth, but as the doors opened, I was met with an uneasy chill that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with empty offices and the occasional flickering light. I made my way down the hall, checking each office as I went. Everything was normal. Empty chairs, neat desks, the faint smell of stale coffee. But there was a tension in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath. I reached the last office, did my routine check, and turned to leave when I noticed something strange. One of the office doors, which I was sure I had closed, was now slightly ajar. I stared at it for a moment, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows. I walked back and pushed the door open, half expecting to see someone inside, but the room was empty. The air was colder here, and I could see my breath fogging up in the beam of the flashlight. I quickly shut the door, telling myself it was just the wind or a faulty latch. But as I turned to head back to the elevator, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing. Just empty offices and the flickering lights overhead. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the old building settling, or maybe even my own footsteps echoing weirdly. But deep down, I knew it wasn't right. I made my way back to the elevator, trying to ignore the unease that gnawed at my gut. I hit the button and the door slid open with that familiar ding. I stepped inside and pressed the ground floor button, eager to leave the 13th floor behind. As the elevator doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, just outside the reach of my flashlight. Tall, with long limbs and a face obscured by shadows. My heart skipped a beat and I jammed the door open button. But when I looked again, the hallway was empty. Just the dull hum of the lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. I was shaken, but I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, maybe even a reflection from one of the glass panels. The elevator doors finally closed, and I took a deep breath, feeling my pulse slowly steadying. But as the elevator descended, the lights flickered, plunging me into darkness. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for my flashlight, when suddenly, the elevator jolted to a stop. I was stuck between floors, in the pitch black, with only the faint sound of cables creaking above. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pressed the emergency button, but there was no response. Just static from the intercom and the suffocating silence. I tried to pry the doors open, but they wouldn't budge. And then, in the darkness, I heard it again. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from somewhere above me. I pointed my flashlight up, but the beam only revealed the metal ceiling of the elevator. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone or something was walking on top of the elevator. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and I backed into the corner, my mind racing. The footsteps stopped directly above me, and for a moment there was silence. Then a slow, scraping sound like nails dragging across metal. The elevator shuddered, and I could feel the vibrations beneath my feet. I tried the emergency button again, desperately pressing it, but all I got was more static. The scraping continued, growing louder, more frantic, as if whatever was up there was trying to claw its way in. I banged on the doors, shouting for help, but my voice sounded small and helpless against the oppressive dark. The lights flickered back on suddenly, and the elevator lurched, continuing its descent. I felt a brief surge of relief as the doors finally opened to the ground floor. I stumbled out, gasping for air, and rushed to the security office. I checked the cameras, hoping to find some explanation for what I had just experienced. But the footage showed nothing unusual, just an empty hallway, the elevator, and me, panicking like a madman. I replayed the footage from the 13th floor, zooming in on the hallway where I'd seen the figure. But there was nothing. No shadowy figure, no footsteps, just the flickering lights and the empty offices. I rubbed my eyes, exhausted and frustrated. Had it all been in my head? A trick of the mind brought on by the long hours and isolation. I was ready to write it off as a hallucination when I noticed something on the screen. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but in the corner of the hallway camera, I saw a door slowly creaking open. The same door I had closed earlier, and there, peeking out just slightly, was the shadow of a figure. Tall, with long limbs, its face obscured. It stood there, motionless, watching. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But just as I was about to rewind the footage, the camera feed cut to static. I stared at the screen, my heart racing, when suddenly the radio on my desk crackled to life. A low, distorted voice whispered through the static. "You shouldn't have looked." The word sent a chill down my spine, and I slammed the radio off, my hands trembling. I quit the job the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't just the 13th floor or the old building. It was everywhere, in reflections and shadows, in the corners of my vision. Months went by and I moved to a new town, trying to leave it all behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside my bedroom door. And I know, deep down, that it's still watching, waiting. Because once you see the night watcher, it never lets you go. And the worst part? I'm starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I was never really alone to begin with. I used to commute to work on the late-night train, a monotonous routine that I never thought much about. The train was usually half empty, filled with the usual crowd of tired office workers, night shift nurses, and the occasional drunk stumbling home. I liked to keep to myself, headphones in, eyes fixed on my phone, counting the minutes until I could collapse into bed. But that night, one that I'll never forget, everything changed. I had stayed late at the office, caught up in a project that wouldn't let me go. By the time I finished, it was past midnight. I hurried to the station, just in time to catch the last train. The platform was deserted, the only sound the distant hum of the city. The train arrived with a loud screech, the doors opening with a mechanical sigh. I stepped in, settling into my usual spot by the window. The train car was nearly empty, just a few scattered passengers, most of them dozing off or staring blankly ahead. I put in my headphones, trying to drown out the dull ache of exhaustion. The train rattled on, the rhythmic clacking of the tracks almost soothing. I closed my eyes, drifting in and out of a light sleep, the gentle rocking of the train lulling me. But something jolted me awake. It was subtle at first, a change in the atmosphere, a slight drop in temperature. I glanced around, and that's when I noticed him. Sitting at the far end of the car was a man I hadn't seen board. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white movies. His clothes were neat, but there was something off about him. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were fixed straight ahead, unblinking. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he was just another late-night commuter with a peculiar taste in clothing. But as I looked closer, I noticed the passengers around him. They were all sitting stiffly, staring ahead just like the man in the suit, their faces expressionless and unnaturally still. A chill ran down my spine. It was as if they were frozen in time, caught in some strange, unmoving tableau. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the eerie feeling, but nothing changed. The man in the suit slowly turned his head, his gaze locking onto mine. His eyes were dark, impossibly dark, like twin voids that seemed to swallow all the light around them. He didn't blink. He didn't move. Just stared. The train slowed, and I glanced at the screen to see which station we were approaching. But instead of the usual station name, the display was blank. I frowned, checking my phone for the time, but it, too, was acting up, frozen on the lock screen, refusing to respond. The train stopped, the doors sliding open to reveal a dark, empty platform. No lights, no signs, just darkness stretching out beyond the train. Nobody moved. The passengers remained seated, staring blankly, the man in the suit still watching me with those unsettling eyes. The doors stayed open for an uncomfortably long time, the cold air seeping in and wrapping around me like icy fingers. My instincts screamed at me to get off, to leave, but I was rooted to my seat, unable to move, unable to look away from the man in the suit. Then, as suddenly as they had opened, the doors slid shut, and the train lurched forward. The lights flickered, plunging the car into darkness for a brief moment before coming back on. When they did, the man was gone. I blinked, scanning the car, but he had vanished. leaving the other passengers still frozen in place. I stood up, my legs shaking, and moved towards the front of the car, looking for the conductor. As I passed by the other passengers, I realized with growing horror that they weren't breathing. Their skin was waxy, their eyes glassy and lifeless. It was like they were mannequins posed and left behind. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled through the car, desperately looking for a way out. The next car was the same: empty seats, dark windows, and a cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I reached the front of the train, where the conductor's cabin should be, but the door was locked, and no amount of banging or shouting got a response. I turned back, but the train car behind me was now filled with thick, choking fog, obscuring everything. I couldn't go back, and I couldn't go forward. I was trapped. The train kept moving faster now, the outside world a blur of darkness. I felt the walls closing in, the air growing colder with every passing second. I huddled against the door, trying to steady my breathing when I felt a presence beside me. Slowly I turned, and there he was, the man in the suit, standing just inches away, his face inches from mine. His mouth opened, impossibly wide, wider than any human mouth should, and from it came a low, guttural whisper that seemed to echo through the train car. I couldn't understand the words, but they were filled with anger, with sorrow, with a longing that pierced straight into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, caught in his gaze. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man stepped back and the train slammed to a stop. The lights flickered violently, and I was thrown to the ground. When I looked up, the train doors were open, and I could see the familiar lights of my station. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled out of the car, stumbling onto the platform. I turned back, expecting to see the man in the suit, but the train was empty, the fog gone, the passengers nowhere to be seen. I stood there panting, my breath visible in the cold air. The train doors closed and it pulled away, disappearing into the tunnel. I watched until the last car vanished from sight, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I checked my phone again, and this time it was working. The time was 3:15 a.m., but my last clear memory was getting on the train at 12:45 a.m. I never took the late train again. I switched jobs, moved to a different part of the city, and tried to forget. But a few months later, I was scrolling through a local history forum when I stumbled across an old photograph of a train platform from the 1940s. Standing on the platform, among the passengers, was the man in the suit, his dark eyes staring straight at the camera. The caption read, "Last known photograph of the midnight ghost train. The train mysteriously disappeared along with all its passengers in 1947 and has been the subject of urban legends ever since." I stared at the photo, my blood running cold. I'd heard stories about ghost trains, but I'd never believed them. Now, I wasn't so sure. I closed my laptop and tried to put it out of my mind, but every now and then when I'm near a station late at night, I think I hear the faint sound of a train approaching, the echo of wheels on tracks. And for a moment, I see him, the man in the suit, standing on the platform, watching, waiting for the next passenger to board. I never believed in ghosts, not really. Sure, I liked a good horror movie now and then, but that's all it was, just stories. That all changed when I inherited my great-uncle's house. Uncle Howard was an odd man, a reclusive artist who spent most of his life in that house, rarely seen outside. When he died, the house passed to me, along with all its contents. It wasn't exactly a windfall. The house was old, crumbling, and full of Uncle Howard's strange art. Paintings covered every wall, depicting eerie landscapes, twisted faces, and abstract shapes that seemed to shift if you looked at them too long. The centerpiece, though, was a large portrait in the living room. A man in a dark suit, with hollow eyes and an expression that sent a chill down my spine. Uncle Howard had painted him dozens of times, but this one was different. It felt alive. The first few nights in the house were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The eyes of the man in the portrait seemed to follow me no matter where I went in the room. It was unnerving, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in a big, creepy house, surrounded by strange artwork. Anyone would feel uneasy, right? Then the noises started. It began with soft tapping sounds like footsteps, but lighter. I'd hear them late at night, usually around 3 a.m., echoing down the long hallway. I'd get up to check, but there was never anything there. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a rodent problem. But it felt wrong, too deliberate, too human. One night, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. This time the sound wasn't in the hallway, it was in the living room. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way towards the noise. As I approached the living room, the tapping stopped. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. My eyes were drawn, as always, to the portrait. The man in the picture seemed different. His hollow eyes were now fixed on something just out of frame, his mouth slightly open, as if he were about to speak. I knew it was impossible, but I could have sworn his expression had changed. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease, and went back to bed. The next day I decided to cover the painting. I draped an old sheet over it, hoping it would ease my nerves. That night the house was quiet, and for the first time in days, I slept peacefully. But the next morning when I went downstairs, the sheet was on the floor, crumpled in a heap. The portrait was uncovered, and the man's eyes seemed to glare at me, his expression more sinister than ever. My pulse quickened. I didn't remember taking the sheet down, and I knew I had been alone all night. I replaced the sheet and went about my day, but a knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. That night the tapping returned, louder and faster. I lay in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, too scared to move. The tapping grew frantic, echoing off the walls, and then it stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, raspy whisper. It sounded like someone trying to speak but not quite managing. My blood ran cold as I realized the sound was coming from the living room. I forced myself out of bed, my legs shaking as I made my way down the stairs. The house was frigid, my breath visible in the dim light. As I entered the living room, I saw it. The sheet was once again on the floor, but this time it was torn to shreds. The man in the portrait looked furious, his mouth now a wide, twisted grimace, as if he were screaming in silent rage. Panicked, I backed away, stumbling over a small table. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture of the painting, thinking I'd show it to someone. Maybe there was an explanation I was missing. But as soon as the flash went off, the lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but when the lights came back on, the portrait was empty. The man was gone. I stared at the blank canvas, my mind reeling. There was no way I was imagining this. The tapping started again, louder than ever, coming from the hallway now, moving towards me. I spun around, and for a split second I saw him, the man from the painting, standing at the end of the hallway. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and his mouth moved soundlessly, as if trying to speak. I blinked, and he was gone. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached my car. I didn't go back inside. I couldn't. I called my friend Lisa, who was into the paranormal, and told her everything. She didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, she asked me to send her the picture I'd taken. I hesitated, but sent it over. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from her. It was a photo she'd enhanced, zoomed in, the brightness turned up. There, in the picture, standing in the corner of the room, was the man from the painting. He was blurry but unmistakable. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized he wasn't just a figure in the painting. He was real, or at least he had been. Lisa called me immediately, her voice shaking. She'd done some quick research and found out that Uncle Howard wasn't just an artist. He was obsessed with the occult, specifically capturing spirits in his work. The man in the painting. He was Howard's last subject, a missing person from decades ago, believed to have vanished without a trace. It seemed Howard had trapped him in the portrait, and now that Howard was gone, the man wanted out. I sold the house as fast as I could with the condition that the portrait stayed behind, locked in the attic where no one would find it. The new owners were happy to oblige. They just wanted the house, not the creepy art. I didn't tell them about the tapping, the whispers, or the man in the painting. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear tapping on my walls, soft and distant. I tell myself it's just the house settling, just the wind. But deep down I know it's him, still searching, still trying to find his way out. I don't look at paintings anymore. I can't, because every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see him. Just a glimpse, a flicker of a man in a dark suit with hollow eyes, watching, waiting, and I'm terrified that one day he'll find a way through. I used to think that the worst part of my job as a real estate agent was dealing with stubborn clients or the never-ending paperwork. But that all changed with the house on Willow Street. It was just another listing, an old Victorian with peeling paint and a sagging porch, the kind of place that had potential, as we like to say. My boss was eager to sell it because it had been on the market for months with no bites. A quick sale, a fat commission, and I'd be done with it. Or so I thought. The first time I went to the house, it was a warm afternoon. I remember because the sun was shining and everything felt bright and normal. But as soon as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just cooler, it was freezing, like someone had left the AC cranked all the way up, except the house didn't have central air. The cold was sharp, biting. I could see my breath. The place was a mess, dust everywhere, cobwebs clinging to every corner, and a strange, musty smell that seemed to cling to my clothes. The layout was typical for a house of its age: narrow hallways, small rooms, and an unsettling amount of dark, cramped spaces. But what really caught my attention was the basement door. It was chained shut, with a heavy padlock securing it. That was strange. I made a mental note to ask my boss about it, but for some reason, I couldn't stop staring at it. Something about the door felt wrong, almost like it was humming with energy. I tried to shake off the feeling and went about taking photos for the listing, but every picture I took seemed off, blurry, with strange streaks of light that I couldn't explain. When I looked through the viewfinder, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the shadows, but when I looked up, there was nothing there. Just an empty, silent house. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the bad lighting, and wrapped up the shoot. As I was about to leave, I heard it. A faint whisper, soft and unintelligible, like someone speaking just below the threshold of hearing. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, and listened. The whispering continued, growing louder, almost urgent. I couldn't make out any words, but it was coming from behind the basement door. I bolted out of there, telling myself it was just my imagination. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door, felt that cold, and heard that whispering. I was too rattled to go back alone, so I convinced a friend, Jake, to come with me the next day. He was a skeptic, always making fun of my overactive imagination, so he was more than happy to prove me wrong. When we got there, the house was even colder than before. Jake laughed it off, but I could tell he was uneasy. We walked through the rooms, Jake making jokes, trying to lighten the mood, but the atmosphere was oppressive. It felt like the house was watching us, waiting. We reached the basement door, and Jake immediately fixated on it. "Let's open it," he said, grinning like it was a dare. I hesitated. The whispering had stopped, but the air around the door was heavy, almost vibrating. Jake didn't wait for my approval. He pulled out a bolt cutter from his backpack. Apparently, he'd come prepared. The chain clattered to the floor and the padlock snapped open with a loud click. The whispering returned, louder now, almost frantic. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Jake swung the door open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into pitch blackness. A cold draft wafted up, carrying the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sour. Jake, always the fearless one, started down the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I followed reluctantly, every step echoing in the tight, narrow space. The basement was unfinished, just a dirt floor and crumbling brick walls. But the strange thing was, it wasn't empty. In the center of the basement was a circle of old, rotting furniture, chairs, tables, all arranged in a precise pattern. In the middle of the circle was a small, worn-out doll, propped up against a broken chair. Its eyes were missing, leaving dark, empty sockets, and its clothes were tattered and stained. Jake laughed nervously, kicking at the dirt. "Probably some kids messing around," he said, but his voice wavered. I wasn't so sure. The whispering was clearer now, like multiple voices all speaking at once, overlapping and urgent. I felt dizzy, disoriented, like the room was spinning around me. Jake reached for the doll, picking it up and examining it. "It's just a toy," he said, but as he held it, the whispering stopped abruptly, plunging the basement into a silence so complete it was suffocating. We stood there, frozen, the air heavy with anticipation, and then, without warning, the flashlight flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness, and the temperature dropped even further. I fumbled for my phone, trying to get some light, but nothing worked. I could hear Jake breathing heavily next to me, his bravado gone. The silence stretched on, oppressive and thick, until suddenly we heard a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't an animal, it was deeper, more guttural, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The furniture began to creak, and the doll fell from Jake's hand, landing with a soft thud. The growling grew louder, reverberating through the walls, shaking the very floor beneath us. "Let's get out of here," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. We turned to go back up the stairs, but the way was blocked. Standing at the top was a shadow, a tall, thin figure, its form barely discernible in the darkness. It was just standing there, unmoving, blocking our escape. We backed away, retreating into the center of the basement. The growling intensified, and the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching out towards us. I felt something brush against my arm, cold, clammy, like the touch of a corpse. Jake was panicking now, yelling at the shadow to move, but it didn't react. It just stood there, silent and menacing. And then, as suddenly as it started, the growling stopped. The flashlight flickered back on, illuminating the empty basement. The shadow was gone, and the whispering had ceased. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind us and relocking the chain. We didn't speak as we hurried out of the house, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. I didn't go back to the house on Willow Street. I handed the listing off to another agent, refusing to set foot in that place again. A few weeks later, I got a call from Jake. He sounded different, distant, like he hadn't slept in days. He told me that he'd been having nightmares, seeing the shadow figure everywhere he went. At first, I thought he was messing with me, but then I heard it. The same low growling from the basement, faint but unmistakable, coming from his end of the line. Jake laughed, but it was hollow, joyless. "I think it followed us," he said, his voice cracking. "I think it's inside now." The line went dead, and I never heard from Jake again. I tried calling him back, but his number was disconnected. I even drove by his apartment, but it was empty, cleared out like he'd never lived there. I don't know what happened to him, but sometimes late at night I swear I can still hear that whispering, like it's waiting just beyond the walls. I've since moved, changed jobs, tried to forget everything about that house. But every now and then, I catch glimpses of shadows where they shouldn't be, hear soft whispers just on the edge of hearing. I keep telling myself it's just my imagination, but deep down I know the truth. The house on Willow Street didn't just want us gone, it wanted something much worse. And I'm afraid that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting for the next one to find it. I've always loved hiking, especially in national parks. There's something about being surrounded by nature, far from the noise and stress of everyday life. that clears my mind like nothing else. So when I heard about the secluded trails at Red Pine National Park, I knew I had to check it out. The park was known for its dense forests, rugged terrain, and breathtaking views, but it also had a reputation for being a bit eerie. There were countless stories of hikers getting lost, strange sounds echoing through the trees, and whispers of disappearances over the years. But I shrugged off the rumors. It's a forest, after all. Places like that are bound to have myths and legends. I packed my gear and set out early one Saturday morning, eager to beat the weekend crowds. The first part of the hike was peaceful, the sun filtering through the trees and the air crisp with the scent of pine. The trail was well marked, and I made good progress, enjoying the solitude and the sound of my footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. Around noon, I came across a sign pointing to an old, less maintained trail that veered off from the main path. The sign was worn and faded, the words barely legible, but I could make out enough. Raven's Point. I'd read about it online, an old lookout spot that had been closed off years ago after a series of accidents. No one really went there anymore, and the Park Service had stopped maintaining the trail. But that only made me more curious. I figured it would be the perfect spot to have lunch, away from any other hikers. A hidden gem, I thought. The trail was overgrown, branches reaching out like skeletal hands, the path barely visible beneath a carpet of dead leaves. But I was confident in my sense of direction. I had my GPS, a map, and plenty of experience. I told myself I'd be fine. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, their branches tangled together overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air felt cooler, heavier, and the forest seemed unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I checked my GPS, but it struggled to get a signal, flickering in and out. My map wasn't much help either. The trail wasn't marked on the newer versions, and the older maps were vague at best. Still, I pressed on, telling myself that I couldn't be far from Raven's Point. That's when I noticed it. The trees around me started to change. They were taller, with twisted trunks and branches that seemed to reach out at odd angles. The bark was darker, almost black, and covered in a strange, oily substance that glistened in the dim light. I touched one out of curiosity, and my fingers came away sticky with a foul-smelling residue. I tried to laugh it off, but the unease settled in my gut like a stone. I kept moving, quicker now, the trail barely discernible beneath the undergrowth. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were eyes on me, hidden in the shadows following my every move. Finally, I reached a clearing. Raven's Point. The view was stunning. An expansive vista of rolling hills and dense forests stretching out as far as the eye could see. But something was off. The trees around the clearing were dead, their branches gnarled and leafless as if the life had been sucked out of them. The silence was suffocating, like the whole world was holding its breath. I set my pack down and took out my lunch, but I couldn't enjoy it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking at the edge of the clearing. The longer I sat there, the stronger the feeling of dread became, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I packed up quickly, deciding it was time to head back. But when I turned around, the trail was gone. I swear I had just come from that direction, but now all I saw was an unbroken wall of trees. No path, no markers, just dense, dark forest stretching endlessly in every direction. I pulled out my GPS, but the screen was blank, just a spinning icon searching for a signal that never came. Panic started to creep in, and I forced myself to take a deep breath. I wasn't lost. I just needed to retrace my steps, find the trail, and get out of there. I walked in what I thought was the direction I'd come from, but the trees seemed to shift around me, closing in like a tightening noose. The forest floor was uneven, littered with rocks and twisted roots that seemed determined to trip me up. I pushed through thick underbrush, branches scraping against my arms and face, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like hours of aimless wandering, I came across something that made my blood run cold, a campsite, or what was left of one, a faded tent, half collapsed and covered in moss, with old camping gear scattered around, rusted and overgrown. It looked like it had been there for years, abandoned and forgotten. But there was no sign of the person who had set it up, just empty cans, a moldy sleeping bag, and a sense of despair that hung heavy in the air. I searched through the remains, hoping to find a clue, something that could help me, but all I found was a weathered notebook. I flipped it open, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. Most of the writing was illegible, smeared and faded, but one page stood out. The words were scrawled in a frantic, shaky hand. "It's watching me. I can't find the way out. It won't let me leave." A chill ran down my spine. I shoved the notebook into my pack and backed away, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer, darker. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root, and turned to run. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper just behind me. It was like the wind, but with a cadence, a rhythm that didn't belong in the natural world. I didn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. Malicious, hungry. I ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, chasing me through the trees. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst through the tree line, back onto the main trail. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked back, half expecting to see something emerging from the woods, but there was nothing. Just the silent, looming forest. I didn't stick around. I grabbed my pack and sprinted down the trail, not stopping until I reached the park entrance. I told a ranger what had happened, about the strange trees, the abandoned campsite, and the whispers. He just nodded, his expression grim. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "That area's been off limits for years. People go in and sometimes they don't come back. We've searched, but it's like the forest swallows them up." I asked about the old campsite, about the person who had left the notebook, but he just shook his head. "We've found things like that before. Gear, notes, even messages carved into trees, but never any people." I left the park that day and haven't gone back. I still love hiking, but there's a part of me that's always looking over my shoulder, listening for that whisper in the wind. Sometimes I dream of that forest, of the twisted trees and the feeling of being watched. I wake up drenched in sweat, the memory of that guttural voice echoing in my mind. And I know deep down that whatever's out there in those woods is still waiting, still watching. I've been a long-haul truck driver for nearly 15 years, and in that time I've seen it all. Midnight storms that make you question your sanity. Lonely stretches of highway where the only company is the occasional tumbleweed, and diners filled with the kind of characters you'd only meet once. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on that stretch of Highway 89 last winter. I was hauling a load of electronics from Denver to Salt Lake City, a route I'd driven 100 times before. It was supposed to be an easy trip, just a straight shot through the mountains. The weather report had called for snow, but nothing major. I figured I'd make it to Salt Lake before the worst of it hit. The first few hours were uneventful, just the hum of the engine and the steady drone of my tires on the asphalt. I had the radio tuned to a classic rock station, and the sky was a flat, unbroken gray, promising snow. As night fell, the first flakes started to drift down, light at first, but quickly picking up in intensity. By the time I hit the mountain pass, the snow was coming down hard, and visibility had dropped to nearly nothing. I flicked on my high beams, but all they did was illuminate the swirling white, making it feel like I was driving through a tunnel of static. I slowed to a crawl, gripping the wheel tight, trying to keep the truck steady on the slick road. About an hour into the pass, my radio cut out. One minute I was singing along to some old Eagles song, and the next, just static. I fiddled with the dial, but every station was the same, just a hiss of white noise. The storm was messing with the signal, I thought, but it added to the unsettling feeling that had started to creep in. That's when I saw her, a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible through the flurries. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I got closer I realized it was a woman. She was wearing a thin white dress that seemed completely wrong for the weather, her long hair whipping around in the wind. She didn't have a coat, didn't even look like she was shivering. Just stood there, staring at me as I passed. I kept driving, my heart pounding. What the hell was she doing out there in the middle of nowhere dressed like that? No car in sight, no signs of a breakdown. Just her, standing still as a statue in the blizzard. I grabbed my radio trying to call into dispatch, but all I got was more static. I was about to pull over and help when a weird sense of dread washed over me. Something about her didn't sit right. The way she was just standing there, not moving, not reacting to the cold. I pushed on, telling myself I'd stop at the next station and report it. But as I rounded the next bend, there she was again. The same woman standing by the side of the road, staring at me as I approached. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the icy road. My heart was racing now. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me that fast, not on foot, not in this weather. I crept past her, my eyes glued to the figure as she disappeared into the snow behind me. I could swear I saw her lips move, like she was trying to say something. But the sound of the engine drowned out everything. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of it. Had I seen a ghost? Was I just overtired and seeing things? I sped up, eager to put distance between me and whatever that was. The snow was coming down even harder now, and my wipers were struggling to keep up. The whole world had shrunk to the small, snow-covered patch of road in front of me. Then my headlights caught something up ahead. My blood ran cold. It was her again, standing right in the middle of the road. I yanked the wheel, trying to swerve around her, and the truck skidded, the tires struggling to find traction on the ice. I managed to steer clear, but I lost control, the truck sliding sideways before coming to a jarring stop against the guardrail. I sat there breathing hard, my hands shaking on the wheel. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her, but there was nothing. Just the falling snow, swallowing everything in its path. I grabbed my flashlight and jumped out, the cold hitting me like a slap to the face. I scanned the road, but she was gone. I was about to get back in the cab when I saw it. Footprints. Small, bare footprints in the snow, leading off the road and into the trees. They were fresh, not yet covered by the falling snow, and they disappeared into the darkness beyond my beam of light. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to get back in the truck and go. But something pulled me forward, a morbid curiosity or maybe just plain stupidity. I followed the footprints into the trees, the wind howling through the branches like a warning. I found her a few yards in, standing with her back to me, facing an old, rusted-out car half buried in the snow. The windows were fogged over, and it looked like it had been there for years. I called out to her, my voice trembling, but she didn't turn around. She just stood there staring at the car. I moved closer, my flashlight flickering in the wind, and that's when I saw it. The car wasn't empty. Inside, slumped over the steering wheel, was a man, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed, frozen in place. The woman finally turned to me, and I took a step back. Her eyes were the same, empty, lifeless, like she was barely there at all. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. I looked between her and the car, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. None of it was. I turned and bolted back to the truck, slipping and sliding on the ice. I scrambled into the cab, slammed the door, and floored it, not caring about the road or the snow or anything else. The radio came back to life as I tore down the highway, the static giving way to a faint, crackling voice. "Missing for over 30 years. Highway closed due to snowstorm." I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road again, but all I saw was darkness. The headlights illuminated nothing but the swirling snow and the endless stretch of asphalt. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop a few miles down the road. I parked, my hands still trembling, and tried to collect myself. I told one of the attendants about what I'd seen, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. Said that part of the highway had been closed off and on for years because of the weather, and no one should have been up there. I didn't argue, I just wanted to get away, to forget about the woman and the car and everything else. But as I sat there, staring at the snow piling up outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of her. A few weeks later, I heard a story from another trucker. He'd been driving the same route, late at night, and saw a woman standing by the road, dressed in white, no coat, just staring. He said he pulled over to help, but when he got out, she was gone. Only thing left were the footprints leading off into the woods. Now, whenever I drive Highway 89, I keep my eyes on the road, my radio turned low, and my foot light on the gas, because I know she's still out there, waiting for someone to stop, someone to listen. And if you're not careful, you might just find yourself following those footprints into the dark, never to return, just like the others. I've worked as a park ranger at Crescent Ridge National Park for about 5 years now. It's a job I love, mostly because it keeps me outside and away from the grind of city life. I've seen a lot during my time here: lost hikers, animal encounters, even a few strange accidents that don't add up. But nothing comes close to what happened last fall, when a routine call turned into something that still haunts me. It was late October, the time of year when the days get shorter and the park starts to empty out. Most of the tourists were gone, leaving only a few dedicated hikers and the occasional camper. I was on a late shift, patrolling one of the more remote sections of the park, when the radio crackled to life. "Dispatch to Ranger Cole, do you copy?" I grabbed the radio, surprised by the break in the usual silence. "This is Cole, go ahead." "We've got a missing hiker reported on the Blue Ridge Trail. Last seen around 1400 hours. Name's Mark Holloway, mid-30s, hiking alone. Can you check it out?" Missing hikers weren't uncommon, especially near sundown when people got turned around. I assured dispatch I'd head that way and set off toward Blue Ridge. The trail was one of the longest and least maintained in the park, winding through dense forest and up steep inclines that could be treacherous if you weren't careful. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees as I hiked up the path. I radioed occasionally, calling out Mark's name, but the only response was the wind rustling through the leaves. After about an hour of searching, I found something: his backpack, lying abandoned near the trail. It was zipped open, the contents spilled out like someone had been rifling through it in a hurry. No signs of Mark, though. Just his gear, scattered like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. I reported the find to dispatch, who told me to keep looking until nightfall. As I continued up the trail, a creeping sense of unease settled over me. The forest was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. I'd been on this trail a dozen times, but something felt different, wrong, like I was being watched. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing still on the path about 50 yards ahead. Relief washed over me as I thought I'd found Mark, but as I got closer I realized something was off. The man was standing unnaturally still, facing away from me, his posture rigid. "Mark," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. The figure didn't move. I got closer, shining my flashlight, and that's when I saw it clearly. It wasn't Mark. The figure was dressed in old, torn clothes, the kind of stuff you'd see in a period film, like he'd stepped out of a different time. His hair was long, matted, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. "Sir, are you okay?" I called out, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't respond, didn't turn around, just stood there with his back to me. I moved closer, and that's when my radio buzzed, loud and sharp, nearly making me jump. "Cole, come in. You need to see this." The dispatcher's voice crackled urgently. I tore my eyes away from the figure and grabbed the radio. "Go ahead." "We got a weird signal picked up from your location, some kind of old distress call, but the frequency doesn't match anything we use. It's coming from near your coordinates, but it's faint. Can you check it out?" I looked up, but the figure was gone, vanished like he'd never been there. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just the empty trail winding through the forest. My pulse quickened, and I told dispatch I'd check out the signal. Following the directions they gave, I veered off the main path, pushing through the underbrush. The sun had almost set by now, the last light fading into a dim, eerie glow that made everything look washed out and unfamiliar. The radio continued to buzz intermittently, picking up bits of that strange signal. Short, rhythmic beeps that sounded like old Morse code, but garbled, like it was struggling to reach through the static of time. I stumbled upon a clearing, and there it was, an old, rusted radio tower, half collapsed and overgrown with vines. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, maybe longer. The signal was coming from inside, a low, faint hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Cautiously, I approached the base of the tower, my flashlight beam bouncing off twisted metal and broken equipment. There was a small shack nearby, its door hanging off the hinges. I peered inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The interior was a mess of ancient radio equipment, the kind you'd see in black and white photos from the early 20th century. And in the corner, slumped against the wall, was another figure. This one was skeletal, dressed in the same old-fashioned clothes, but the most disturbing part was the face. The eyes were open, staring straight ahead, empty and hollow. A deep gash ran across the throat, long since dried and dark. I backed out, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The radio signal grew louder, more insistent, filling the clearing with its ghostly beeps. I looked around, half expecting to see more figures emerging from the woods, but there was nothing, just the cold mechanical pulse of the signal. I radioed in, voice shaking as I tried to explain what I'd found. Dispatch was confused. They couldn't identify the signal and told me to head back immediately. As I turned to leave, the signal suddenly changed. The rhythmic beeping stopped, replaced by a low, droning hum that seemed to resonate inside my skull. I sprinted back to the trail, not caring about the branches that tore at my clothes or the roots that tried to trip me. The forest felt alive, like it was closing in, every shadow twisting into something that watched and waited. When I finally reached the main path, I paused to catch my breath and looked back. In the fading light, I saw them, figures just like the ones before, standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the trees. They were all facing me, their bodies still, their faces blank and featureless. I didn't stick around to count how many. My instincts screamed to get out, to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. I made it back to my truck and sped to the ranger station. I tried to explain what I saw, but the words sounded crazy, even to me. They sent a search team back the next morning, but they found nothing. No figures, no old tower, no signal. The trail was as normal as it ever was, like it had all been some twisted illusion. But I know what I saw. I can still hear that signal sometimes, late at night when I'm alone. It's faint, barely audible, but it's there, an echo of something that refuses to be forgotten. The missing hiker was never found, and every so often I wonder if he became one of them, a watcher in the woods, forever caught in that silent, watching crowd. I still work at Crescent Ridge, but I avoid the Blue Ridge Trail. Something lives there, something ancient that doesn't belong, and I can't help but feel that it's waiting, sending out that signal, calling others in, luring them closer until they're lost too. Lost, just like Mark, just like the rest. I've always been drawn to the quiet, untouched corners of nature, the places where you can lose yourself in the beauty of the wild. That's why, when my friends and I planned a camping trip to the secluded part of Blackwater National Park. I couldn't have been more excited. It's one of those places that's not on the usual tourist maps, rumored to have breathtaking views, ancient trees, and trails that seem to stretch forever. We were 4 in total, me, Jack, Lisa, and Tim. We'd been hiking and camping together for years, and this trip was supposed to be just another adventure, nothing we hadn't done before. We set out early on a Friday morning, armed with enough supplies to last a long weekend, eager to explore a trail that was supposedly marked but less traveled. We had maps, compasses, and even a GPS. But as we ventured deeper into the park, we began to notice that the trail markers were faded, some even missing. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to swallow us. The trees were massive, ancient giants with thick canopies that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was quiet, eerily so, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of our boots crunching on the fallen leaves. We joked about it at first, making up stories about cursed woods and lost hikers. It was all in good fun, at least at the start. After hours of hiking, we reached a clearing with a stunning view of a distant mountain range. We decided to set up camp there, exhausted but happy with our progress. As night fell, we built a fire, shared stories, and laughed over the usual camping fare of roasted marshmallows and lukewarm beer. It was perfect, the kind of night that makes you forget about everything else. Around midnight, the fog rolled in. Thick and heavy, it draped itself over the trees and crept toward our camp. We hadn't expected it. There was nothing in the forecast about fog. It was so dense that within minutes the trees around us faded into ghostly silhouettes. Our fire's glow seemed to shrink, swallowed by the white blanket that surrounded us. It was then that we heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on wood. We paused, listening. It was coming from somewhere beyond the fog, steady and deliberate. Jack, always the curious one, suggested it might be a woodpecker, but it didn't sound right. Too slow, too deliberate, almost like a signal. Probably just someone else out here messing around, Tim said, but his voice lacked confidence. Lisa suggested we ignore it and go to bed. We agreed, though the tapping continued, steady and relentless, as we climbed into our tents. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the tapping grew louder, echoing in my mind. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke to the sound of a scream. It was Lisa. She was standing outside her tent, staring into the fog with wide, terrified eyes. We rushed out, asking her what was wrong, but she just pointed. We followed her gaze, but there was nothing, just the dense fog and the shadows of trees. "I saw someone," she whispered, her voice shaking, standing right there, just staring at me. We tried to reassure her, suggesting it was just her imagination, but she was insistent. She described a tall figure, barely visible in the fog, watching her from the edge of the clearing. We scanned the area with flashlights, but found nothing. Tim joked nervously about the legendary ghosts of Blackwater, but none of us laughed. We decided to stay up together, sitting by the fire that was now more for comfort than warmth. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Hours passed, and the fog finally began to lift with the first light of dawn. We packed up quickly, eager to put some distance between us and whatever had spooked Lisa. As we set off, we noticed something strange. The trail we had followed into the clearing was gone. In its place was nothing but dense undergrowth and trees that hadn't been there before. We checked the map, the GPS, everything, but it was like the trail had simply vanished. Tim joked that we'd gone off course, but his voice had lost its bravado. It was clear we were lost. We tried to retrace our steps, but every direction looked the same. The trees felt closer, the forest darker. We argued, the tension mounting as hours ticked by and the sun climbed higher. I kept checking the map, convinced we'd find our way if we just kept moving, but nothing matched. It was like the forest had shifted overnight, rearranging itself to trap us. As the sun began to dip, we heard the tapping again. It was closer this time, echoing through the trees with a rhythmic certainty. We stopped, exchanging nervous glances. I called out, my voice cracking, but there was no response. Just the tapping growing louder and more insistent. Jack, frustrated, decided to march toward the sound. "Enough of this crap," he muttered, storming off into the trees. We shouted for him to stop, but he disappeared into the underbrush, the fog starting to creep in again as if drawn to his footsteps. Minutes passed, then an hour. Jack didn't return. We called for him, our voices growing hoarse, but there was no answer, just the tapping, which seemed to follow us wherever we went. We set up a makeshift camp as night fell, hoping Jack would find his way back. Lisa was shaking and Tim was muttering under his breath, repeating that we'd find him at first light. But as darkness enveloped the forest, we all knew something was terribly wrong. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We huddled together, the fire barely keeping the encroaching cold at bay, and waited for dawn. When the first light broke through, we set out again, calling Jack's name until our throats were raw. But all we found was an abandoned hiking boot, half buried in the dirt, and a faded trail marker that pointed in every direction at once. Tim's face went pale when he found it. "This wasn't here yesterday," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The tapping started again, closer than ever, almost mocking. It echoed in every direction, like the forest itself was toying with us. Lisa broke down, sobbing, saying she saw shadows moving just beyond the trees, figures that vanished when you looked straight at them. I tried to keep us moving, but every step felt like we were sinking deeper into some ancient, forgotten place that didn't want us to leave. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the tapping stopped. The forest went silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you feel like you're underwater. We stumbled into another clearing, our hearts pounding, and there he was. Jack was standing in the center, staring blankly at us. Relief flooded through me, but as we got closer, it turned to horror. His eyes were vacant, glassy, and his skin was ashen. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there like a mannequin someone had placed in the woods. We tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond. He wouldn't move, wouldn't speak. It was like he was frozen in place, trapped in some unseen force. Tim reached out to touch him, but as soon as his hand made contact, Jack crumbled, literally fell apart, collapsing into a pile of decayed clothing and bones, as if he'd been dead for years. We ran. I don't remember much after that. Just the sensation of sprinting through the forest, the trees blurring around us, and the sound of that damn tapping chasing us every step of the way. By some miracle, we found the main trail and stumbled out onto the ranger station, collapsing in front of the shocked staff. We told them everything, but when they went back to search, they found nothing. No clearing, no remains, no sign that Jack had ever been there. We never spoke of it again. Lisa moved away, Tim stopped hiking altogether, and I can't go near the woods anymore. I still hear the tapping sometimes late at night in my dreams. Rhythmic, deliberate, like a countdown. And I know it's only a matter of time before the forest calls me back. I've always loved hiking. There's something about the fresh air, the solitude, and the sense of freedom that comes from being surrounded by nature that's unlike anything else. So when I heard about the old trail up in Hollow Pine Forest, I couldn't resist. It was a path less traveled, overgrown, and rarely maintained, but the promise of untouched scenery was too tempting to pass up. I packed my gear, laced up my boots, and set out early one Saturday morning, eager to explore. The trailhead was easy to find, a small clearing marked by a faded wooden sign warning hikers about the difficult terrain. The forest was dense, the trees towering above, their branches knitting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. As I made my way deeper into the woods, the trail became less distinct. The path was narrow, with thick underbrush and twisted roots that made every step a challenge. I didn't mind. This was what I'd come for, nature in its raw, untamed state. I lost track of time, focused on navigating the terrain and taking in the sights and sounds of the forest. After about an hour, I noticed something strange. The usual forest noises, birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of squirrels, had gone silent. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I stopped listening, but heard nothing except my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, even though the sky was clear. I pressed on, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of unease grew with each step. The trees seemed closer together, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I stumbled over a root, catching myself just before I fell, and cursed under my breath. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, just off the trail, was a figure. A man, standing perfectly still among the trees. He was dressed in old, tattered hiking gear, the kind that looked decades out of style, and his skin was pale, almost gray. I called out to him, waving, but he didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and empty, like he was looking right through me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step closer, but the man remained motionless. Something about him didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was this wrongness, like he didn't quite belong there. I called out again, louder this time, asking if he was okay or if he needed help, but he didn't even blink. I decided to keep moving. Maybe he was just a lost hiker, I thought, or someone who didn't want to be bothered. I turned back to the trail, quickening my pace, but every few steps I glanced over my shoulder. The man hadn't moved, but I could still feel his eyes on me. The trail wound deeper into the woods, and soon I lost sight of him. I tried to shake off the encounter, but the unease lingered. I couldn't help but think about how strange it was for someone to be standing out there alone and unresponsive. The forest felt different now, less like a peaceful escape and more like a maze that was trying to swallow me whole. As I rounded a bend, I nearly tripped over something on the ground. It was an old hiking boot, half buried in the dirt. I picked it up, inspecting it, and realized it was covered in moss, like it had been there for years. Nearby, I found a rusted canteen and the remnants of a weathered backpack. It looked like someone had abandoned their gear long ago. That's when I noticed the smell, faint at first, but unmistakable. The sour, metallic stench of decay. My stomach turned as I followed the scent, pushing through a thicket of bushes. And then I saw it. A body, half hidden under a pile of leaves and branches. The skin was leathery and stretched tight over bones. The clothes tattered and faded, blending almost perfectly with the forest floor. My heart raced as I stumbled back, horror washing over me. It looked like the body had been there for years, forgotten by time. But what caught my attention was the face. It was the same man I'd seen earlier, the same lifeless eyes staring up at me, frozen in a silent scream. I backed away, my mind spinning. It didn't make sense. I'd just seen him standing not far from here. How could he be dead, and for so long? Panic set in and I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. I turned, ready to bolt back the way I came, but as I did, I saw him again. The figure was there, standing on the trail just a few yards away. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his eyes, those dark, empty eyes, were locked on mine. I felt rooted to the spot, my breath catching in my throat. He took a step toward me, slow and deliberate, his movements jerky, like a puppet on tangled strings. I ran. I didn't care about the path or where I was going. I just needed to get away. The forest blurred around me, branches whipping against my skin as I tore through the underbrush. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and relentless, like something was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized I was lost. The trail was gone. The trees all looked the same, and the forest was deathly silent. I spun around, searching for any sign of where I'd come from, but all I saw were trees stretching endlessly in every direction. And then I heard it, a low, raspy whisper that sent shivers down my spine. It was the man's voice, distorted and distant, like it was coming from all around me. "You're not supposed to be here." I turned in circles trying to find the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder and I screamed, spinning around to find nothing. I was alone. I stumbled forward, my mind racing, desperate to find the trail. I kept hearing the whisper, the man's voice repeating the same phrase, growing louder and more insistent. "You're not supposed to be here." Finally, I broke through the trees and onto a dirt road. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I just kept running until I reached a small ranger station near the park entrance. I burst inside, frantic and covered in scratches, babbling about the body, the man in the woods. The ranger gave me a puzzled look, but he took me seriously enough to call the authorities. They searched the area where I'd found the body, but when they returned, they told me there was nothing there. No body, no old gear, nothing. Just an overgrown trail that hadn't been used in years. I insisted on what I'd seen, but they chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe a hallucination from dehydration or heat stroke. I knew what I saw, though, and I could still feel those eyes on me, watching from somewhere deep in the forest. It wasn't until weeks later that I stumbled across an old article online, buried in the archives of a local news site. It was about a hiker who'd gone missing in Hollow Pine Forest over 30 years ago. They'd never found his body, but there was a photo of him, a grainy black and white image of a young man in hiking gear. It was him, the same man I'd seen in the forest, the same dead eyes staring out from the photograph. I don't hike anymore, not after that. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, lost between the trees, waiting for the next person who wanders too far off the path. And I can't help but wonder if, somehow, I didn't just see a ghost, but something worse. Something that's still searching for a way back, still trying to find the place where he was supposed to be. And the scariest part? I think he's still looking for me. I manage a small historic hotel named The Haven on the edge of a quiet town. The hotel has been in my family for generations, and it's known for its charm and vintage appeal. It's also known for the occasional peculiar guest, but nothing could have prepared me for the events of one particular autumn night. It was a cold, rainy evening when a lone traveler arrived at the hotel. He was a tall man, dressed in a vintage dark suit and carrying an old-fashioned leather suitcase. His demeanor was polite but distant, and his eyes had a strange hollow quality. He introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell and requested a room for the night. I checked him in and showed him to his room on the 3rd floor. It was an old, rarely used room with creaky floorboards and a grand antique bed. As Mr. Caldwell entered, he paused to admire the view from the window, which overlooked the mist-covered town. He seemed lost in thought and thanked me before closing the door behind him. That night, as I was preparing to close the front desk, I noticed that the lights flickered and the air grew colder. I thought it was just an old building quirk, but decided to investigate. I walked through the hotel, checking the lights and ensuring everything was in order. As I passed by Mr. Caldwell's room, I heard soft, melancholic music playing. It was a tune I didn't recognize, but it was hauntingly beautiful. I knocked on the door to check if everything was all right, but there was no response. When I opened the door, the music stopped abruptly. The room was dimly lit, with shadows dancing across the walls. Mr. Caldwell sat by the window, staring out into the fog. The music had stopped, but there was an old, ornate music box on the dresser that hadn't been there before. I asked Mr. Caldwell if he needed anything, but he simply shook his head and said he was fine. Feeling uneasy, I left the room and went back to the front desk. The music started again, this time more insistent. Unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss, I decided to call Mr. Caldwell's room again. This time I heard him speaking softly, but the words were muffled and incoherent. I could hear the sorrow in his voice, and it unsettled me further. Around midnight, the lights flickered more violently, and a chilling draft swept through the lobby. I decided to investigate the source of the disturbance. As I made my way back to Mr. Caldwell's room, I noticed an old faded photograph on the floor outside his door. It showed a young couple standing in front of a grand old hotel, strangely similar to mine, but from a different era. I picked up the photograph and knocked on Mr. Caldwell's door once more. This time he opened it slightly, revealing a face filled with profound sadness. He invited me in and asked if I could listen to a story that had haunted him for decades. He told me he had once stayed at this very hotel with his beloved wife many years ago. They had planned to stay there for a romantic getaway, but a tragic accident had occurred during their visit. His wife had died, and he had never returned. He had carried the grief with him, and the music box was a last, desperate attempt to relive the memories of that fateful night. Mr. Caldwell revealed that the music box was a gift from his wife, and he had brought it with him to find some semblance of closure. The haunting melody was a tune they had danced to on their last night together, a song that now echoed with their lost dreams and unfulfilled promises. The photograph was from their stay, taken in front of the hotel. He had been searching for the hotel for years, guided by the hope that returning would somehow bring him solace. As he spoke, the room grew colder, and the music box began to play once more, filling the space with its melancholic tune. I could see the sadness in Mr. Caldwell's eyes, and I felt a deep empathy for his plight. Moved by his story, I decided to help. I arranged for a small memorial in the hotel's garden, where Mr. Caldwell and his wife had once enjoyed their time. I placed the photograph and a note in front of the memorial, honoring their lost love. That night, as Mr. Caldwell stood by the window, the music box played one final bittersweet melody. The room seemed to lighten, and a peaceful aura filled the space. Mr. Caldwell thanked me and told me he felt a sense of closure he hadn't felt in years. As the dawn broke, Mr. Caldwell checked out of the hotel, leaving behind a heartfelt note of gratitude. He left with a sense of peace, and the air around the hotel seemed to lift, as if the weight of his sorrow had been released. The hotel continued to operate as it always had, but the story of Mr. Caldwell and his wife became a cherished part of its history. The music box remained in a place of honor in the hotel lobby, a reminder of the love that endures beyond the constraints of time and the comfort that can be found in memories. And though the hotel had seen many guests come and go, the tale of the last guest lingered in the whispers of the walls, a testament to the enduring power of love and the search for closure in the echoes of the past. The rain hammered against the windows of the abandoned library, each droplet echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. I was the new night security guard, tasked with watching over this relic from the past. The building had been closed for years after a series of bizarre accidents, but the city had decided to reopen it, and I was the unfortunate soul assigned to protect it during the night. As I settled into my chair at the front desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The library was a maze of towering bookshelves and hidden alcoves, and the shadows seemed to dance in the flickering light. I chuckled nervously at my own imagination. After all, it was just an old building filled with dust and forgotten stories. My shift began uneventfully. I inspected the main reading room, the old wooden tables worn smooth by time. Dust motes floated in the beams of my flashlight, creating an ethereal atmosphere. I made my way through the aisles, the scent of aging paper and ink engulfing me. But as the clock struck midnight, an unsettling chill swept through the library. The temperature plummeted, and my breath formed small clouds in the air. I glanced at the large clock on the wall, its hands frozen in time, as if mocking my unease. I decided to check the upper floors where the old archives were stored. Each step creaked beneath my weight as I ascended the staircase, the dim light barely illuminating the path ahead. When I reached the second floor, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was thick, stifling, as if the very walls were holding their breath. As I walked through the narrow aisles of dusty books, I heard it, a soft rustling sound like pages turning. I froze, my heart racing. I turned off my flashlight and listened intently, the silence wrapping around me like a shroud. The sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. I flicked on my flashlight again and aimed it toward the source of the noise, but the light illuminated only empty shelves. My skin prickled. Trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, I moved deeper into the archives, my footsteps echoing ominously around me. Then I spotted it, a figure standing at the far end of the aisle, barely visible in the shadows. My stomach dropped. It looked like a woman, her back turned to me, standing perfectly still among the books. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. "Are you lost?" The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I took a hesitant step closer, the air growing heavier with each step. As I reached out to touch her shoulder, she suddenly turned, and my breath caught in my throat. Her face was gaunt, hollowed eyes staring back at me, devoid of emotion. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged, just a chilling silence that sent shivers down my spine. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance. I turned to run, but the aisles seemed to twist and turn, leading me deeper into the labyrinth of books. The woman was gone, but I could feel her presence, lurking just beyond the light. I raced down the staircase, my heart pounding in my chest, desperate to escape. As I reached the front desk, I grabbed my walkie-talkie, trying to call for help, but the static crackled violently. Something was wrong, very wrong. I glanced back toward the library's entrance, and that's when I saw her again, standing at the threshold, her face a mask of sorrow. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing through the empty space. I was trapped, caught between the world of the living and the haunting shadows of the past. The air grew colder still, and the lights flickered ominously. I backed away, but the woman stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward me. "Please don't leave me," she begged, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. I felt a strange compulsion to help her, but a deep instinct told me to run. I turned to flee, but the library seemed to shift around me, the aisles closing in, the shadows growing darker. My heart raced as I sprinted toward the front door, praying it would open. Just as I grabbed the handle, I felt a cold grip on my shoulder. I spun around, and there she was again, her expression now twisted in anguish. "You have to listen," she cried, her voice rising to a scream. "They don't want me to leave." In that moment, I realized the truth. The library was a trap, a prison for lost souls. I was not the watcher. I was the watched. The whispers of the past began to flood my mind, stories of those who had come before me, who had tried to escape but were never seen again. Desperation took hold, and I wrenched the door open, bursting out into the rain-soaked night. I ran, not looking back, the echoes of her cries following me into the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the library, leaving the haunted building behind. But as I drove, I could feel her presence lingering, a chill in the air that reminded me of what I had narrowly escaped. And then, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my blood turned to ice. There, sitting in the back seat, was the woman, her eyes full of sorrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. "You can't escape me," she whispered, her voice now a haunting echo in the confines of the car. In that moment, I realized my fate was sealed. The library had not let me go. It had merely found a new way to keep me. The last thing I heard before the world faded to black was her chilling laughter, blending with the sound of the rain. I've been a security guard at the old Oak Ridge Library for just over a year. The library was one of those grand historic buildings that seemed to whisper stories from its walls. But it had its share of dark legends, tales of ghostly figures lurking in the stacks and books flying off shelves. I had always dismissed them as mere folklore until one fateful night. It was a stormy evening, the rain pounding against the library's windows, creating a symphony of unsettling sounds. I settled into my usual spot at the front desk, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows across the room. The library was empty, save for the occasional creak of the old building settling and the distant rumble of thunder. As the clock struck 11 p.m., I began my rounds. I walked through the labyrinth of bookshelves, the musty smell of paper and aged wood surrounding me. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I passed by the children's section where I had heard strange laughter before, but tonight there was nothing, just silence. Suddenly I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the back of the library. My heart raced as I turned in the direction of the noise. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. No response. I cautiously made my way toward the sound, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I approached the rear section, I felt a chill run down my spine. I had always been uneasy about this part of the library. It housed the rare books collection, a section often whispered about by the staff. As I entered the rare books room, the rustling stopped and the air grew heavy. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. I scanned the room, and that's when I noticed it. A book lying open on the table, its pages flipping as if caught in an invisible wind. I stepped closer, my curiosity getting the better of me. The title read, "The Watcher's Curse." I had never seen it before. As I leaned in to read, a gust of icy wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind me. Panic surged through me and I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The only answer was the thunder rumbling outside and the incessant flipping of the pages. I turned back to the book, my eyes drawn to a passage that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "Beware the watcher who sees all. It feeds on fear, drawing in those who linger too long in the shadows." Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath. I felt a presence behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness and the looming shelves of books. I took a step back, my heart racing as I realized I was not alone. The whispers started then, low and haunting, echoing through the room. "Stay. Stay with us." They surrounded me, and I felt their cold fingers brushing against my skin. The shadows seemed to stretch and contort, forming shapes that danced just beyond my vision. "Get away from me," I shouted, desperate to escape. I pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, taunting me, filling my mind with dread. I could feel their fear, their despair. They were trapped here, just like I was about to be. In a moment of sheer panic, I turned back to the book and read aloud the passage I had seen before. "Beware the watcher who sees all." My voice echoed, and the room seemed to vibrate with energy. The whispers halted, and the shadows recoiled for a brief moment. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged, a tall, shadowy silhouette with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. I stumbled back, pressing against the door, my heart racing. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I am the Watcher," it replied, its voice a chilling whisper. "I see all who enter this place. I have watched you since your first night here." The Watcher stepped closer, and I could feel its cold breath on my face. "You have lingered too long in the shadows, Alex. The library feeds on the lost and forgotten. You are now part of its story." In that moment, I understood. The library was alive, and it thrived on fear and despair. I had been drawn here, just as so many others had been before me. The Watcher was not just a guardian. It was a collector of souls, and I was about to become another chapter in its dark tale. Desperate, I turned back to the book and read the next line. To break the curse, one must confront their own fears. I focused on my deepest fear, the loneliness that had haunted me my entire life. I had always felt like an outsider, never truly belonging anywhere. "I'm not afraid of you," I declared, my voice gaining strength. "I will not be another lost soul." The watcher paused, its form flickering as if the very essence of it was being challenged. You cannot escape the shadows. But I pressed on, channeling every ounce of courage I could muster. I choose to face my fears. I will not be consumed. With that declaration, the air crackled with energy, and the shadows surged forward, enveloping me. I closed my eyes, fully embracing my fear, and suddenly, the darkness exploded around me, shattering into countless pieces. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the main library, standing at the front desk. The storm had passed, and the first light of dawn was creeping in through the windows. The library was silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I glanced around, half expecting to see the watcher lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, only the soft rustle of pages turning in the gentle breeze. That day, I learned the truth. The library held many secrets, but I had escaped its grasp. As I left the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow changed. The library would always be a part of me, and though I had faced the watcher and survived, I knew it was only a matter of time before someone else would wander into the shadows, drawn by the echoes of the past, and I would be there, watching, waiting, to ensure they would not succumb to the darkness that lurked within. I'm a night security guard at the old Merrifield Hotel. It's a place with a storied past, faded elegance, whispers of scandal, and tales of the ghostly inhabitants who refuse to leave. I took the job to help pay off student loans, but I never expected the horrors that awaited me during my shifts. The hotel had been closed for renovations for years, yet I was assigned to patrol its halls each night, ensuring no one trespassed. The first few nights were eerie but relatively uneventful. I'd hear the occasional thump or creak, but I dismissed them as the building settling. That is, until the night I discovered the room with the red door. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I first saw it. I was making my rounds on the second floor when I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was painted a vibrant red, a stark contrast to the peeling wallpaper surrounding it. Curiosity gnawed at me, and against my better judgment I approached. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a dim light flickering inside. I pushed it open, revealing a small room filled with antique furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. In the center stood an ornate mirror, its surface reflecting the flickering light of an old lamp. As I stepped in, I felt an icy draft wash over me, sending shivers down my spine. I peered into the mirror, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing behind me, a woman in a vintage gown, her face obscured by shadows. Startled, I whipped around, but the room was empty. Just my imagination, I told myself. I turned back to the mirror, and there she was again, closer this time, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak. "What do you want?" I whispered, my heart racing. But the words caught in my throat as the air grew heavy and the lights flickered violently. Suddenly the mirror shattered, sending shards flying across the room. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I dashed out of the room, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. The hotel felt alive, the walls whispering secrets I couldn't decipher. I quickly returned to the security desk, my heart still racing. I needed a break from whatever madness had just unfolded. But as I sat there trying to calm my nerves, the lights went out. Darkness enveloped the hotel, and I cursed under my breath, fumbling for my flashlight. When I finally flicked it on, the beam illuminated a figure standing at the far end of the lobby. It was her, the woman from the mirror. She was closer now, her gown flowing like smoke, her features becoming clearer. I could see her face twisted in anguish, and her eyes were pools of sorrow. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing through the empty space. "I'm trapped here." I hesitated, fear battling against a strange pull of empathy. "How?" I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. "The mirror. It binds me. You must destroy it." I turned to look back toward the second floor, my mind racing. The thought of facing that room again sent chills through me, but something deep inside urged me forward. I couldn't leave her trapped like this. I climbed the steps, my flashlight flickering as I approached the red door. It stood ominously, seemingly untouched since my last encounter. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open once more. The room was now darker, the furniture still draped in dust, but the mirror lay shattered across the floor, glinting like broken teeth. "Do it," she urged, her voice echoing in my mind. "Free me." I gathered my courage and stepped closer, gathering the largest shard I could find. "I'm going to break the rest," I said, my voice trembling. "Just hang on." As I raised my arm ready to shatter the remnants of the mirror, a force gripped my wrist, stopping me cold. I looked up into the woman's eyes, but they had transformed. No longer filled with sorrow, they now burned with something sinister. "You should have left well enough alone," she hissed. Terror flooded my veins as the truth hit me. This wasn't a plea for help. It was a trap. She wasn't bound to the mirror. She was using it to lure me. I dropped the shard and stumbled back, my heart racing as I tried to escape. But the room began to shift around me. The walls closed in, the doors vanished, and I was engulfed in darkness. I could hear her laughter, echoing in the void. "Now you're mine." Desperation surged through me, and I charged toward the last remnants of light, my hands outstretched. I crashed into a wall, but it felt like flesh, cold and unyielding. I was trapped within her domain, lost in the depths of the Merrifield Hotel. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was her voice, sweet and mocking, whispering, "Welcome to your new home, Alex." And in that moment, I knew I had become yet another lost soul, forever bound to the hotel, waiting for the next unwitting security guard to wander in and share my fate. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. I'd rented a small cabin in the woods, far from the hustle and bustle of city life, the kind of place where you can hear the wind through the trees and nothing else. Or so I thought. The first night was peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustle of leaves. I had a small fire going, a good book, and a hot cup of cocoa. Everything was perfect. But that serenity was short-lived. Around midnight, I heard a faint scratching sound. It was so subtle that at first I thought it was just the house settling, but as the minutes ticked by, the scratching grew louder, more persistent. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably an animal outside. Still, a growing unease gnawed at me. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, but the night was eerily silent. The scratching had stopped, and I couldn't find any sign of disturbance around the cabin. I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, and went back inside. That night, as I lay in bed, the scratching resumed. It was louder now, like something, or someone, was trying to get in. My heart raced as I clutched the flashlight, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a tree branch brushing against the wall. But the noise persisted. Unable to sleep, I finally decided to check again. I opened the cabin door and shined my flashlight around, but there was nothing. The scratching had stopped. Relieved, I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the outside of the cabin, just below the window, were deep scratches, so deep they almost looked like claw marks. I felt a shiver of terror, but dismissed it as the work of a wild animal, maybe a raccoon or something similar. The next few nights were worse. The scratching became more frequent, and sometimes I could hear faint whispers as if someone was standing right outside my window. I began to feel like I was being watched, my paranoia intensifying with each passing hour. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I set up a camera to record the outside of the cabin, hoping to catch whatever was tormenting me. I stayed awake, watching the live feed on my phone. Around 3 a.m., I saw it. In the darkness outside, a shadowy figure moved slowly across the frame. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered nightgown. Her face was obscured, but I could see her moving deliberately, as if she were searching for something. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched, too terrified to move. I checked the footage again the next morning. The woman was there, pacing outside my window, but she was gone before dawn. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up my things and prepared to head back to the city. As I was about to leave, I noticed something on the camera feed that made my blood run cold. There was a new recording from the night before. I watched it with trembling hands. The figure was back, but this time she was standing right outside the window, staring directly into the cabin. Her face was still hidden in shadow, but her eyes were glowing, piercing through the darkness. And then I saw something that made me gasp. As the camera zoomed in, I realized that the woman wasn't just standing there. She was moving closer to the window, reaching out with her hand, her fingers extending toward the camera. The feed cut out abruptly and the screen went black. I ran out of the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The twist. When I finally reviewed the footage with a friend who was a tech expert, he discovered something chilling. The woman was not just a ghost or a lost soul. She was a person who had been missing for years. Her name was Emily Harris, reported missing in the area where my cabin was located. But here's the kicker. When I did some research, I found out that Emily Harris was my great-aunt, a name I'd only heard in old family stories. She had disappeared under mysterious circumstances decades ago. Her disappearance was a family secret, one I had no idea about until I saw the footage. I don't know what happened to Emily or why she was haunting that cabin, but I do know that I'm never going back. Sometimes, when the night is still and quiet, I can almost hear the faint scratching sound, as if she's still out there trying to reach out to me from the darkness. So there you have it, a haunting tale with a twist that hits close to home. If you enjoyed this chilling story, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more spine-tingling content. Remember, sometimes the darkness holds secrets we're not prepared to uncover. Stay safe and keep the lights on. I've worked as a courier for a small delivery service in the outskirts of Maplewood for the past 3 years. Generally, my job was straightforward: pick up packages from local businesses and drop them off at their designated addresses. Most of my interactions were mundane, but one rainy evening, everything changed. It was a Thursday, the kind of night where even the streetlights seemed to dim under the weight of the clouds. The rain fell in sheets, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I had just finished my last delivery when I received an urgent call from my boss. "Sarah, we have a special package that needs to be delivered tonight. The client is waiting. It's important." "Where to?" I asked, already feeling a sense of dread curl in my stomach. "Out on the old Miller Road. It's a bit of a drive, but the address is marked. Just be careful. It's remote out there." I glanced at the clock, 8:45 p.m. I had never been to that part of town, known for its eerie reputation and abandoned buildings. But the thought of the hefty bonus my boss promised for the late-night delivery pushed me to agree. Driving through the rain, I turned onto Miller Road. The trees loomed overhead like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky, and the ambiance turned from unsettling to menacing. As I navigated the winding road, I spotted a dilapidated house in the distance, its windows dark and vacant. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me as I pulled into the gravel driveway. The house looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Weeds climbed the walls, and the shutters hung askew. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But the promise of extra cash and my boss's insistence compelled me forward. I grabbed the package from the passenger seat, a small unmarked box wrapped in brown paper, and approached the door. I knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. A moment passed before the door creaked open, revealing a shadowy figure silhouetted in the dim light of the foyer. "You must be the courier," a soft voice said, tinged with an unsettling calm. "Yes, I have a delivery for—" I began, but the figure stepped into the light. It was an elderly woman, her skin pale and her eyes hollow. She wore a long, tattered dress that seemed to cling to her as if it were a part of her. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "Come in, dear," she beckoned with a frail hand. "It's not safe out here." Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was thick and musty, filled with the scent of decay. The woman led me into a dimly lit sitting room cluttered with old furniture, and I placed the package on a dusty table. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for this." What is it?" I asked, curiosity piqued despite my unease. "It's a family heirloom," she replied, her gaze drifting to the window as if expecting someone. "It needs to be returned to its rightful place." Before I could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window, causing the lights to flicker. I felt a chill wrap around me, and I instinctively took a step back. "I should get going." "No," she said, her voice rising with unexpected intensity. "You must stay until it's done. The shadows are restless tonight." I glanced at the door, contemplating a hasty exit. But before I could make a move, the lights flickered again, and I caught a glimpse of something dark slithering past the window. My heart raced as I turned back to her, only to find her staring intently at the box. "Open it," she urged, her eyes wide with desperation. With trembling hands, I untied the package. Inside lay a small, intricately carved wooden box. It radiated an unsettling energy, and I could almost hear whispers emanating from it. Soft, mournful cries that sent chills down my spine. "What's in there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Only what must be returned," she said cryptically. "But first you must understand. The spirits of my family have been trapped for years. They need to be freed." My pulse quickened as the room grew colder. "Freed? How?" "The box holds their essence. You must return it to the old cemetery, where our family rests." As if summoned by her words, a loud thud echoed through the house and the lights flickered violently. I felt a rush of panic. Shadows began to swirl around me, and I realized I was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the darkness, ghostly apparitions of the woman's family, their faces twisted in anguish. "Help us," they wailed in unison, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. I stumbled back, clutching the wooden box. I can't help you," I stammered, terror gripping me. The woman's expression shifted, her face hardening. "You must. You're the only one who can." Desperation clawed at me, and with a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the box and fled the house, the shadows nipping at my heels. I sprinted to my car, heart pounding against my ribs, and sped towards the cemetery. The rain pounded against my windshield, blurring my vision, but I couldn't stop now. I had to return the box and save myself from whatever darkness had been unleashed. I reached the cemetery just as the clock struck midnight, the moon casting eerie shadows across the graves. I leapt from the car, clutching the box tightly. As I approached the family mausoleum, the voices of the spirits grew louder, their cries echoing in my mind. I placed the box at the base of the mausoleum and began to speak the words I had heard the woman say, hoping to find the strength to release them. "By the bond of blood and spirit, I return what is lost," I chanted, trembling as the wind howled around me. Suddenly the ground shook and a bright light erupted from the box, enveloping me in warmth. The spirits swirled around me, their faces softening with gratitude. "Thank you," they whispered, their voices merging into a harmonious melody. As the light faded, I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. The shadows receded, and I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. I had done it. I had freed them. But as I stood up, ready to leave, I heard a faint echo of the woman's voice behind me. "You'll always be a part of us now." I turned, but the mausoleum stood empty, the air still and silent. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. I had delivered the package, but in doing so I had become entwined with their fate. As I drove away, the weight of their presence lingered in my mind. I glanced into the rearview mirror, and for a fleeting moment, I saw their faces watching me from the darkness. From that day on, I continued my deliveries, but I could never shake the feeling that I was never truly alone. The last delivery had changed everything, binding me to the echoes of that night forever. My name is Ethan Cole, and I've always had a fascination with the forgotten. As an urban explorer, I thrived on the thrill of diving into the eerie remnants of places left behind. When I stumbled upon an old, decrepit carnival just outside town, I felt a rush of excitement. It was said to be haunted, a relic of a tragedy that unfolded decades ago when a fire broke out during a performance, claiming the lives of several performers and attendees. I arrived at dusk, the sky painted in hues of purple and orange, casting a surreal glow on the rusted rides and faded banners. With my camera in hand, I stepped through the broken gate, the sound of crunching gravel beneath my boots echoing in the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. As I wandered through the remnants of the carnival, I felt a chill run down my spine. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its once bright colors now dulled by time. I approached it, camera ready, captivated by the eerie beauty of the structure. Then I heard it, a soft melodic tune drifting through the air, like a forgotten lullaby. My heart raced. It shouldn't be possible. The carnival had been abandoned for years. Intrigued, I followed the sound, my feet leading me toward the carousel. The painted horses, frozen in time, grinned as I approached, but my gaze was drawn to the center where a tall figure stood. A man dressed in a faded ringmaster costume, his eyes glinting in the twilight. "Welcome, welcome," he boomed, his voice a deep rumble that sent shivers down my spine. "Care for a ride?" I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. "Sure," I replied, trying to mask my unease. The ringmaster gestured grandly, and I climbed onto one of the horses, its surface cold and lifeless beneath me. As the carousel began to turn, the haunting melody grew louder, wrapping around me like a shroud. I glanced around, realizing that the carnival wasn't as empty as I thought. Spectral figures began to materialize, the spirits of those who had perished in the fire. They swayed gently, their expressions a mix of joy and sorrow, their laughter echoing through the air. I felt a strange connection to them, as if they were welcoming me into their fold. The ride picked up speed, the world blurring around me, and I closed my eyes, surrendering to the experience. But then, the laughter turned sinister, morphing into cries for help, and I opened my eyes to find the ringmaster's gaze fixed on me, his smile widening unnaturally. "Join us," he shouted, his voice ringing with an otherworldly power. Panic surged through me, and I tried to leap off the horse, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, bound by some dark force. The carousel spun faster, the ghostly figures closing in around me, their faces twisted in agony. I could feel their despair wrapping around me, clawing at my sanity. I realized the truth. They were trapped here, just like I was destined to be. Suddenly the music shifted, a discordant note ringing out that made my ears ache. The ringmaster's face contorted in rage. "You shouldn't have come here. You will never leave," he roared, his voice echoing like thunder. With a surge of adrenaline, I fought against the invisible restraints holding me in place. I focused on the camera still slung around my neck, and in a desperate move, I raised it and aimed at the ringmaster. "I'll capture you," I shouted, hoping that somehow the act of photography would give me power over this nightmare. I pressed the shutter, and a blinding flash erupted from the camera, illuminating the carousel and the figures surrounding me. For a moment, everything froze, caught in the light. The ringmaster's expression shifted from anger to surprise and then to horror. The flash shattered the illusion, and the figures screamed, dissolving into wisps of smoke. As the carousel slowed, I felt the weight lifting from my body. I leaped off the horse and stumbled backward, breathless and shaken. The carnival began to crumble around me, the laughter fading into silence. I turned to run, fear propelling me forward, and I dashed toward the exit, the gate swinging open as if welcoming my escape. I burst through the gate and collapsed on the ground outside, gasping for air, heart racing. I looked back at the carnival, now shrouded in darkness, the vibrant colors replaced by shadows. The air was still, the haunting melody extinguished, but I could sense the lingering presence of those lost souls. In a moment of relief, I glanced down at my camera, ready to delete the images from that night. But when I opened the gallery, my heart sank. The last photo displayed was not of the carousel or the ringmaster, but of me with the ringmaster standing behind me, a wicked grin on his face. The realization crashed over me like a wave. I had captured more than just an image. I had sealed my fate. The carnival would always haunt me, a tangle of shadows and whispers, and though I had escaped physically, I knew I would never truly be free of the last ride. I could feel him watching me, waiting for the moment I would return, and deep down, I knew that I would. My name is Oliver, and I've always been fascinated by the paranormal. As a podcaster dedicated to exploring ghost stories, I often sought out the most haunted locations for first-hand accounts. When I heard about Hollow Hill, a site notorious for its eerie happenings and tragic history, I knew it was the perfect place for my next episode. Hollow Hill was an old mining town, long abandoned after a series of accidents claimed the lives of many miners. The townsfolk had fled, leaving behind their homes and a heavy silence that wrapped around the place like a shroud. Locals whispered of strange lights flickering in the night, voices echoing through the empty streets, and shadowy figures that roamed the hills. I couldn't resist the allure of uncovering its secrets. I arrived at dusk, setting up my equipment in what used to be the town square. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I began recording. Welcome to Hollow Hill, a place steeped in tragedy and whispers of the past. Tonight we'll explore the stories that haunt these grounds. As I spoke, a chill swept through the air, and the wind rustled the leaves, almost as if the town were responding. I felt a shiver of excitement, but also a twinge of fear. The stories of the miners weighed heavily on my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After wrapping up my introduction, I decided to explore the remnants of the town. I wandered down narrow streets, my flashlight beam dancing across crumbling buildings and shattered windows. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath my feet. As I approached the old tavern, I heard it, a soft whisper that seemed to drift on the wind. I paused, straining to listen. "Help us! Help us!" Heart racing, I switched on my recorder. "Is anyone there?" I called out, hoping to provoke a response. The whispering continued, growing fainter, almost pleading. "Help us!" I stepped inside the tavern, the door creaking ominously. The interior was dark and damp, remnants of a once vibrant atmosphere now suffocated by decay. I moved deeper into the building, the whispers growing louder, echoing off the walls. "Who needs help?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What happened here?" Suddenly a cold draft swept through, and I shivered as I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I turned to leave, but at that moment a figure appeared at the far end of the room, a translucent shape of a man, dressed in worn mining gear, his face twisted in anguish. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. "Who are you?" I stammered, raising my recorder. "What do you want?" The figure pointed toward the entrance of the tavern, and I felt a rush of air as if urging me to follow. My instincts screamed at me to run, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. I stepped forward, compelled by a force I couldn't explain. The figure led me outside and into the woods that bordered the town. The whispers had transformed into a chorus of voices, rising and falling like a haunting melody. "Help us. Find the truth," they urged in unison. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I stumbled upon an old mine entrance, partially hidden by overgrown brush. The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified, echoing off the stone walls. "In here. Help us find peace." With a mix of fear and determination, I stepped inside the mine, my flashlight beam illuminating the damp walls. The darkness felt suffocating, and I could hear the faint sound of dripping water echoing in the distance. I pressed on, my heart pounding. As I navigated the winding tunnels, I began to see faint flickers of light ahead, like tiny candles illuminating the path. I followed them, the whispers guiding me, until I reached a cavern filled with shimmering crystals that reflected the light in a mesmerizing dance. But the beauty was short-lived. In the center of the cavern lay a collapsed section of the mine, and beneath the rubble, I could see the outlines of what appeared to be bodies, miners trapped in a tomb of stone. The sight sent a wave of horror through me. "Help us," the voices pleaded, more desperate than before. "Free us." I realized then that these were the souls of the miners, trapped in the darkness, unable to move on. I fumbled with my phone, recording the scene. "I'm here to help you," I whispered, though doubt gnawed at me. I pulled my flashlight closer, examining the rubble. "How can I set you free?" I asked, but the voices only grew louder, a cacophony of despair. "Uncover the truth. Break the curse." With a deep breath, I began to clear the debris, my hands shaking as I unearthed the bodies of the miners, their faces frozen in eternal agony. I felt a surge of energy as I worked, the whispers echoing in my mind, guiding me through the process. Hours passed, but I couldn't stop. I was driven by a need to help, to free them from their suffering. Finally, as I cleared the last of the rubble, the cries faded, replaced by a profound silence. A soft glow filled the cavern, and I turned to see the figures of the miners standing before me, their faces now peaceful. "Thank you," they whispered in unison, their voices now a gentle caress. "You have freed us." As the light enveloped them, I felt a warmth wash over me, a sense of relief that filled the air. The miners' figures began to fade, their expressions serene as they disappeared into the light. I stood in the cavern, breathless as the echoes of their voices transformed into a soothing melody, fading into the distance. I had helped them find peace, but the experience had changed me forever. The weight of their sorrow had lifted, and I felt a new purpose blooming within me. I made my way out of the mine, the whispers now a gentle breeze in my ears. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over Hollow Hill. As I left the town behind, I knew I would carry their stories with me, sharing their truths with the world. And in the depths of Hollow Hill, the echoes of the past had finally found their rest, leaving behind a silence that felt like hope. I've always had a love for the outdoors. Growing up in a small town called Pine Hollow, I spent my childhood exploring the dense woods that surrounded my home. But as I grew older, the woods began to feel different, darker, more foreboding. Still, I couldn't resist the call of the wild, so I often took long hikes to clear my mind. One late autumn afternoon, I decided to venture deeper into the forest than I ever had before. The leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the air was crisp and invigorating. I was searching for the rumored hidden lake, a place said to be beautiful but often avoided due to local legends of something sinister lurking within the woods. As I trekked further, the trees thickened and a thick fog began to roll in, wrapping around the trunks like ghostly tendrils. I felt a shiver run down my spine but pressed on, determined to find the lake. It was then that I noticed the silence. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves had vanished, replaced by an unsettling stillness. I finally stumbled upon a clearing and gasped in awe. Before me lay the hidden lake, its surface smooth and glassy like a mirror reflecting the gray sky. The beauty of the scene was mesmerizing, but as I approached the water's edge, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. Something was off. As I knelt down to touch the water, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Just the oppressive fog hanging low, swallowing the landscape. Shaking off the feeling, I decided to take a few photographs, hoping to capture the lake's haunting beauty. As I snapped pictures, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I felt as if I were being watched. I turned around and caught a glimpse of a figure standing at the edge of the trees, a tall silhouette just beyond the fog. My heart raced. "Hello?" I called out, but the figure remained motionless, shrouded in mystery. I stepped back, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I took a few more photos, but each time I looked up, the figure was still there, watching silently. Panic began to rise in my chest. I decided it was time to leave. I turned to head back, but the path I had taken seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the fog. I retraced my steps, trying to remember the way, but the woods felt alive, shifting around me. The trees loomed tall and twisted, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just out of sight. "Stay calm, Jenna," I whispered to myself, but fear clawed at my throat. I picked up my pace, weaving in and out of the trees, desperately searching for a familiar landmark. The fog thickened, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Jenna, come play with me." I froze, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the stillness. "Jenna, come play." The voice was sweet, almost childlike, but it sent chills down my spine. "Go away," I screamed, adrenaline kicking in. I turned to run, but the whispers grew louder, surrounding me, echoing through the trees. "Stay with us. Forever." Dread filled my veins as I pushed through the fog, blindly sprinting in a random direction. The whispers transformed into laughter, chilling and haunting. "Join us, Jenna." Suddenly, I broke through the fog and found myself back at the lake. The water was eerily calm, reflecting the darkening sky. But now the figure stood at the water's edge, clearer than before. It was a child, with hollow eyes and an unsettling grin. "Why are you scared?" the child asked, tilting its head. "We just want to have fun." I backed away slowly, heart racing. "I'm not here to play," I shouted, but the child took a step closer, the fog swirling around it like a shroud. "Don't you want to stay? It's so much fun here forever." With a surge of panic, I turned and bolted back into the woods, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the child's laughter following me, echoing in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging me to stop, to turn back. Finally, I burst through the trees, emerging onto a familiar trail. I ran with all my might, heart pounding in my chest, not daring to look back. The laughter faded, but the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and suffocating. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, and jumped inside, locking the doors. I sat there trembling, staring at the woods that had swallowed my childhood refuge. The whispers faded into silence, but something in my gut told me they weren't gone for good. Weeks passed, but the memory of that day haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind in those woods. And then, one evening, I received a message from a friend who had gone hiking in the same area. "Hey, did you see the news? They found a missing child near the old lake." The word sent chills down my spine. The child from the lake. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was waiting for me. That night, I dreamed of the woods. The fog rolled in, and I heard the child's voice calling to me, sweet and inviting. "Jenna, come play with us." I woke in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The feeling of dread washed over me, but deep down, I knew I couldn't run from it forever. I had to go back. The following weekend, I returned to the woods, determined to confront whatever had been lurking there. I made my way to the hidden lake, the path clearer in the daylight but still shrouded in an eerie silence. As I approached the water's edge, I felt the familiar chill in the air. The fog rolled in once more, thick and suffocating, and there, standing in the shallows, was the child, smiling with that same twisted grin. "Welcome back, Jenna," it said, its voice echoing across the lake. "You finally came to play." I stood frozen, caught between fear and a strange compulsion to step closer. As the whispers surrounded me, I took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing I couldn't escape the darkness of the woods any longer. "Let's play," I whispered, and as I stepped into the water, the laughter erupted around me, and I felt the pull of the lake, drawing me into its depths, where shadows danced and secrets waited to be discovered. My name is Lisa Hawthorne, and I'm an antique dealer in the small fog-laden town of Eldridge. For years I've traveled near and far, seeking hidden treasures and forgotten relics to sell in my quaint shop, Hawthorne Antiques. Each piece I acquired had its own story, but none prepared me for the day I stumbled upon an object that would change my life forever. It was a rainy afternoon in late November when I visited a decrepit estate sale on the outskirts of town. The old mansion, once grand, was now a shell of its former self, overtaken by nature. As I wandered through the dusty rooms filled with cobwebs and memories, I felt a strange pull toward a small, ornately carved box tucked away in a corner. Its design was intricate, adorned with symbols I didn't recognize. I carefully opened the box, revealing an assortment of peculiar items: a tarnished locket, a faded photograph of a family, and a delicate porcelain doll with hauntingly lifelike eyes. As I lifted the doll, a shiver ran down my spine, and I felt a whisper of warning in the back of my mind. Ignoring the feeling, I purchased the box, eager to uncover its history. Back at the shop, I displayed the doll prominently on a shelf, its unsettling gaze drawing in curious customers. But as days turned into weeks, strange occurrences began to unfold. At night, I would hear faint whispers echoing through the shop, and shadows danced just beyond the reach of light. I brushed it off as the creaking of the old building, but deep down, I knew something was amiss. One evening, as I was closing up, I noticed the doll had shifted positions. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I had been working late and was exhausted. But the next night, I found the doll on the floor, its porcelain face cracked slightly, as if it had been thrown. The air grew heavy, and an inexplicable chill settled in my bones. Desperate for answers, I researched the items in the box. The photograph depicted a family who had lived in the estate long ago, the Harringtons. They were known for their eccentricities and rumored to have dabbled in the occult. The doll was said to be a vessel for their dark practices, meant to collect the souls of those who crossed its path. My heart raced as I pieced together the chilling history. Determined to rid myself of the cursed doll, I decided to return it to the estate. The drive through the fog-drenched streets felt haunting, every shadow lurking close. As I arrived at the mansion, the wind howled and the trees swayed like ghostly figures. I stepped inside, the air thick with an oppressive silence. As I placed the doll back in its box, a loud crash echoed through the empty halls. I turned, heart racing, to find the once quiet house alive with whispers. "You cannot leave," they chanted, rising in intensity. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, the shadows coalescing into dark figures that crept closer. "Who are you?" I shouted, voice trembling. The figures shifted, taking on the forms of the Harrington family, their faces twisted in anguish. "You took our child," one of them cried, pointing a bony finger at the doll. "You must return what is ours." I backed away, desperate for an escape. "I didn't know. I only wanted to help," I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. The shadows swirled and the room grew colder. "You cannot return what has been taken," they whispered, their voices dripping with sorrow and rage. With no other choice, I ran through the maze of the mansion, desperately searching for a way out. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. I burst through a door, finding myself in a small, dimly lit room filled with forgotten trinkets. In the corner, I spotted a mirror hanging on the wall, its surface smudged and cracked. An idea sparked in my mind. I rushed toward it, hoping to find a way to break the curse. I grabbed the doll, clutching it tightly, and held it up to the mirror. "Show me your true self," I screamed, and in an instant the mirror flashed with a brilliant light. I saw the Harrington family's tragic past, their desperate attempts to keep their child's spirit alive, their madness pushing them to cruel practices. The doll was their last connection, their only hope of reclaiming what they had lost. Suddenly the room shook, and the shadows lunged at me, their cries echoing in my ears. "You cannot possess her," I shouted, and with every ounce of strength I threw the doll into the mirror. The glass shattered, and a blinding light erupted, engulfing the figures and the room in a furious storm. As the chaos subsided, I found myself back in my shop, the morning sun filtering through the windows. The doll was gone, and the whispers had ceased. But as I caught my breath, I noticed something chilling. The photograph of the Harrington family remained on my desk, now cracked and faded, but their eyes, they were watching me. I realized then that the curse had not been broken, it had merely shifted. The Harringtons remained tied to me, their sorrow now a part of my life. I could feel their presence lingering in the corners of the shop, waiting for the next opportunity to reclaim what was once theirs. The collector's curse was now mine, and I was forever bound to the legacy of the Harringtons, haunted by their whispers and watched by their mournful eyes. The antiques in my shop were no longer just relics of the past. They were vessels of a darker truth, and I had become their unwilling guardian. My name is Sarah Blake, and I've always been drawn to the world of photography. I spent years capturing the beauty of landscapes, the essence of people, and the fleeting moments of life. But as I embarked on my latest project, a photo journal of abandoned places, I stumbled upon something far more sinister than I could have imagined. It was a cool evening in late February 2024 when I arrived at the old Ashford Manor, a once grand estate that had been left to rot for decades. Stories whispered through the local town spoke of its tragic past, a family torn apart by misfortune and madness. Intrigued, I set up my camera, determined to document the decaying beauty of the manor. As I stepped inside, the air felt thick with sorrow. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that streamed through the cracked windows, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. I wandered through the rooms, snapping photos of peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and the remnants of a life once filled with laughter. But as I entered the parlor, I felt an inexplicable chill settle in the room. In one corner stood an ornate mirror, its surface tarnished and covered in dust. Drawn to it, I wiped the grime away, revealing my reflection. The moment I looked into the glass, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Behind me, in the dim light, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a woman, dressed in a long, flowing gown, her face obscured by shadows. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. Brushing it off as my imagination, I continued to explore, but unease nagged at me. I took photo after photo, the camera's shutter clicking rhythmically, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, harboring secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. As evening fell, I decided to set up my tripod and take some long exposure shots of the grand staircase. The dim light cast eerie shadows, and I felt a strange energy course through me as I framed the shot. Just as I was about to click the shutter, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows and I heard a soft whisper, barely audible. "Help me." Startled, I looked around, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I composed myself and pressed the shutter, capturing the moment. When I reviewed the photo, I gasped. In the background, there was the outline of the woman from the mirror, her face now clearer, haunted and pleading. I felt a chill wash over me. This was not an ordinary photograph. Determined to learn more, I spent the next few days researching Ashford Manor and discovered a tragic tale. The woman in the photograph was Elizabeth Ashford, the last resident of the manor, who had vanished under mysterious circumstances a century ago. Local legends claimed she had been cursed, her spirit trapped within the walls, forever searching for a way to escape. That night I returned to the manor, armed with my camera and a flashlight. I needed to confront whatever presence lingered there. As I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. I made my way back to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. "Elizabeth," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. "I want to help you." To my surprise, the temperature dropped and the mirror began to shimmer. I stepped closer, heart racing, and felt a pull toward it. "Help me," the voice whispered again, more insistent this time. I reached out, placing my hand against the cool surface, and suddenly the world around me shifted. I was no longer in the manor. I stood in a lavish ballroom filled with laughter and music. The atmosphere was bright, the air fragrant with flowers. Confused, I looked around, and there she was, Elizabeth, dancing gracefully among the guests, her face radiant. But as I approached, the laughter faded, and the room began to darken. The guests turned to me, their eyes hollow and empty. "Sarah, help me!" Elizabeth cried, her voice frantic. "I'm trapped!" The shadows closed in around us, and I realized the truth. This was not a celebration. It was a trap. The curse of Ashford Manor had ensnared me, drawing me into Elizabeth's torment. As the darkness consumed the ballroom, I felt a surge of panic. "I can't leave you," I shouted, desperate to save her. "Find my portrait. It's the key," she screamed, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. Just as the shadows reached for me, I was thrust back into the manor, gasping for air. The realization hit me like a wave. I needed to find Elizabeth's portrait, hidden somewhere in the manor. I raced through the rooms, fueled by adrenaline and fear. I searched high and low, but the house seemed to twist and turn, evading my grasp. Finally, in the attic, I discovered a dusty old trunk. Inside, I found a faded portrait of Elizabeth, her eyes filled with sorrow and longing. I held it tightly, feeling an electric surge of energy. "Elizabeth," I called out, hoping she could hear me. "I found it." The moment I spoke, the air shimmered and the darkness began to recede. A warmth enveloped me, and Elizabeth appeared, her form glowing with light. "Thank you, Sarah," she exclaimed, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've freed me." As she reached out, a blinding light engulfed the room. I felt a surge of energy, and the manor quaked around me. In that moment, I realized that Elizabeth's freedom came at a price. The mansion began to collapse, the walls crumbling as shadows clawed at the light. "Run," Elizabeth urged, her voice echoing in my mind. I dashed down the stairs, heart racing, and leaped through the front door just as the house imploded behind me. I tumbled onto the ground, gasping for breath, and turned to watch the remnants of Ashford Manor disappear into a cloud of dust. I had survived, but as I looked down at my camera, I found something chilling. The last photograph I had taken before the chaos showed not the ruins of the manor, but Elizabeth standing at the threshold, her face a mask of sadness. "You'll never truly be free," the photograph seemed to whisper. I realized then that while I had freed Elizabeth, the curse of Ashford Manor had claimed a piece of me. I was forever bound to the spirit of the woman in the photograph, destined to wander the world with her haunting memories etched into my soul. And as the sun set behind the mountains, I felt her presence linger, a gentle reminder that some stories are never truly over. I never believed in ghosts until I moved into Willow Creek Manor. It was a steal, a beautiful Victorian mansion for a fraction of what it should have cost. I should have known better. In this world, you get what you pay for. The first few nights were peaceful. I was lulled into a false sense of security by the creaking floorboards and settling noises typical of an old house. But on the fourth night, I woke to whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I strained my ears I could make out words. "She's here," they said. "Finally." The voices seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just a dream. But night after night, the whispers returned, growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out most of what they said, but one phrase kept repeating. "Join us." During the day, I researched the house's history. I discovered that in 1892, the entire Willow family, mother, father, and 3 children, had disappeared without a trace. The case was never solved. As weeks passed, strange things began happening. Objects moved on their own. Doors slammed shut. I'd wake up with unexplained bruises. Once I could have sworn I saw a pale face watching me from the mirror, but it vanished when I turned around. I tried to leave, but something always stopped me. My car wouldn't start. A sudden illness would overcome me. It was as if the house itself didn't want me to go. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. "What do you want?" I shouted into the darkness. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then a child's voice spoke clearly, "We want to be whole again." The walls began to bleed, dark liquid oozing from every crack and crevice. The floor beneath me softened, and I sank into it as if it were quicksand. I screamed, but the house swallowed my cries. As I sank deeper, I saw them, ghostly faces pressed against the inside of the walls, hands reaching out to me. The Willow family, trapped for over a century. And now, I realized with horror, I was joining them. Just before the wall closed over my head, I heard one final whisper. "Welcome home." I don't know how long I've been here. Time has no meaning in this limbo. I've become one with the house. My consciousness spread throughout its walls and floors. I can feel every creak, every settling beam, and I wait. Wait for the next unsuspecting soul to be lured by the promise of a beautiful home at a bargain price. Because now I understand, the house must feed, and we, its trapped souls, must help it do so. So if you're watching this and considering buying a suspiciously cheap old mansion, take my advice. Sometimes a deal is too good to be true. And sometimes the ghosts you should fear aren't the ones you can see, but the ones that have become the very walls around you. Remember, in Willow Creek Manor, home is where the horror is. And once you're here, you'll never leave. We'll be waiting for you, in the whispers in the walls. I never should have taken that job at the old radio station, but as a struggling audio engineer fresh out of college, I was desperate for any opportunity. When WKRP offered me the night shift, I jumped at the chance. The station was housed in a crumbling Art Deco building on the outskirts of town. From the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was thick and stagnant, carrying a faint metallic tang. The vintage equipment hummed with an unsettling intensity, as if alive. My first few nights were uneventful, if eerie. I'd play pre-recorded segments and field the occasional call from an insomniac listener. But as the week wore on, strange things began to happen. It started with interference. Random bursts of static would cut through broadcasts, carrying whispered fragments I couldn't quite make out. I checked and double-checked the equipment, but could find no explanation. Then came the calls. Late-night listeners reporting that they were hearing things, voices and music that weren't part of our programming. When I reviewed the tapes, I heard nothing unusual. I chalked it up to sleep-deprived imaginations, but on my 7th night, everything changed. I was alone in the booth when the lights began to flicker. The air crackled with electricity. Suddenly, every piece of equipment in the station roared to life simultaneously. Radios, recorders, even the old reel-to-reel machines we never used. A cacophony of voices filled the air, overlapping and distorting. I could pick out snippets, news reports from decades past, old advertisements, drama serials, and underneath it all, a constant pained wailing. Panicked, I tried to shut everything down, but nothing responded to my touch. The voices grew louder, more frenzied. I felt a pressure building in my head, as if my skull might burst. That's when I saw them. Spectral figures began to materialize throughout the station. Men and women in period clothing from every decade, their faces twisted in anguish. They reached for the microphones, desperately trying to make themselves heard. With dawning horror, I realized the truth. This station wasn't just broadcasting signals, it was trapping souls. Every voice that had ever gone out over the airwaves was imprisoned here, endlessly repeating their final broadcasts. I ran for the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. The ghostly crowd turned towards me, their eyes hollow and hungry. 1,000 hands reached out, pulling me towards the main microphone. "Join us," they whispered in unison. "Be heard forever." I felt my mouth opening against my will, words I'd never spoken pouring out. My voice joined the chorus, looping and distorting. I don't know how long I've been here now. Time has no meaning in this echo chamber of lost souls. But if you're listening to this broadcast, heed my warning. Be careful what you put out into the airwaves. You never know what might be listening, or what might never let you go. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that radio station, the signal cutting through impossible distances, carrying the anguished pleas of the damned. And if you listen closely, you might just hear my voice among them, forever trapped in the echo chamber. As an interior designer, I've always thrived on the thrill of transformation. The prospect of breathing new life into forgotten spaces excited me, and my latest project was no exception. The old Whitmore Manor, an expansive estate that had sat vacant for decades, was my canvas. I could already envision how I would turn its dusty corners into beautiful living spaces. It was a crisp October afternoon in 2023 when I first stepped through the creaking double doors. The manor was a magnificent relic, with its grand staircase and towering ceilings. But a sense of unease lingered in the air, a heaviness that seemed to whisper the secrets of the past. I began my journey through the house, documenting every room for my YouTube channel. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're exploring the incredible Whitmore Manor. Let's uncover its history and see what we can do with this space, I said brightly, though I felt a shiver run down my spine. As I moved through the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to dance around me, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning. But I was determined to push through, dismissing my fears as mere nerves. It was in the library that I first noticed something unusual. Behind a shelf filled with dusty books, there was a door, partially hidden and slightly ajar. My curiosity piqued. I pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. "What do we have here?" I murmured, excitement bubbling within me. I switched on my flashlight and descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The narrow passage opened into a forgotten room, its walls lined with faded wallpaper and old furniture covered in white sheets. A sense of dread washed over me as I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the weight of memories long buried. In the center of the room stood an ornate mirror, its frame intricately carved with figures that seemed to writhe and twist. I approached it cautiously, the whispers growing louder, echoing in my mind. "Clara, help us," they seemed to call. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. "It's just an old house," I told myself, but the whispers grew more insistent. "Help us. Free us." I raised my camera to capture the mirror, but as I peered into the glass, I gasped. Instead of my reflection, I saw the room filled with shadows, figures standing around me, their faces contorted in anguish. I stumbled back, heart racing, but the whispers pulled me closer. "What do you want?" I shouted, panic clawing at my throat. The shadows swirled, closing in on me, and I felt an icy grip on my wrist. "Free us!" they cried in unison, their voices merging into a deafening roar. Just then the mirror shimmered, and I caught a glimpse of a woman trapped within it, her expression a mix of despair and longing. "You must help us," she pleaded, reaching out with trembling hands. I could feel her desperation, the weight of her sorrow crashing down on me. "No, I can't," I started, but the shadows surged forward, enveloping me in darkness. I felt myself being pulled into the mirror, the coldness seeping into my bones. "Help us!" The voices echoed as everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was back in the room, but everything felt different. The mirror stood before me, now reflecting my terrified expression. I stumbled backward, realizing that the shadows had retreated, but their whispers lingered, echoing in my mind. "Clara, you must help us." The woman's voice was now a haunting melody that filled the room. "We are trapped here, cursed to remain." I could feel the weight of their sorrow pressing down on me, and I knew in that moment that I couldn't leave them behind. "How?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How can I help you?" "Uncover the truth," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "Find the key to our freedom." With renewed determination, I began to search the room, sifting through the dusty furniture and peeling wallpaper. As I rummaged through an old chest, I uncovered a stack of letters, yellowed with age. They told the story of the Whitmore family, of betrayal, loss, and a tragic accident that had left them trapped in the manor. As I read the final letter, a chill ran down my spine. It spoke of a hidden key, one that could unlock the mirror and set their spirits free. "The key lies where the sun sets," it read, "in the heart of the home." I raced upstairs, the whispers urging me on. I searched every room, every corner, until I finally found it, a small, intricately designed key hidden in the back of a drawer in the master bedroom. My heart raced as I made my way back to the hidden room, the shadows swirling around me in anticipation. I inserted the key into the lock of the mirror, feeling the weight of the spirits behind me. With a deep breath, I turned the key. The mirror shimmered, and the shadows coalesced into forms, their faces filled with hope. "Thank you, Clara," the woman said, her voice now filled with warmth. "You've set us free." In an instant, the mirror shattered, releasing a blinding light that engulfed the room. I shielded my eyes, and when I opened them again, the room was empty. The shadows gone, the whispers silenced. I stood alone in the forgotten room, the mirror's remnants scattered around me. A sense of peace washed over me, and I knew that I had fulfilled my purpose. The spirits of the Whitmore family would finally find their rest. As I exited the mansion, the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the estate. I turned back for a moment, a smile on my face, knowing I had transformed not just the manor, but the lives intertwined within it. And as I walked away, I felt a warmth in my heart, a whisper of gratitude that would stay with me forever. I run a quaint little antique store called Timeless Treasures in a sleepy town. My shop is filled with all sorts of curiosities, old clocks, vintage jewelry, and mysterious trinkets. Among them was a doll I found in a dusty box at an estate sale. Its porcelain face was cracked, its hair matted, but there was something unsettlingly captivating about it. I set the doll on a shelf in the corner of the shop, thinking it would attract the interest of collectors or enthusiasts. As soon as it was on display, strange things began to happen. It started subtly. Objects in the shop would shift position overnight. Books fell from shelves and picture frames were found askew. I dismissed these occurrences as the natural quirks of an old building, but there was a lingering unease I couldn't quite shake. One evening, as I was closing up the shop, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the direction of the doll. I froze, straining to listen, but the whispering stopped as soon as I turned my head. The next day, a woman named Mrs. Hawkins came into the shop. She was an elderly woman with a kind face and a gentle demeanor. Her eyes fell on the doll immediately. She approached it with a reverent, almost fearful expression. "That doll," she murmured, her voice trailing off. "Where did you get it?" I told her I had found it at an estate sale. She seemed troubled but refused to explain further. She left the shop without buying the doll, but her reaction made me even more curious about its origins. That night I decided to research the doll. I found a small tag attached to its dress with a name, Lila. I looked into the local archives and discovered a disturbing story. Lila had once belonged to a girl named Emily, who had mysteriously vanished decades ago. According to the records, Emily's parents were heartbroken, and the case remained unsolved. The doll was the only thing left behind. As I read the story, the lights in the shop flickered, and the temperature dropped suddenly. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the connection between the doll and the disappearance. The whispers I had heard became louder, almost as if they were trying to tell me something. Later that night I heard the whispers again, this time clearer and more urgent. They seemed to come from the doll. I approached it cautiously, and as I did, the doll's head slowly turned toward me, its eyes appearing to follow my every movement. The whispers grew louder, forming fragmented sentences. "Help me," "Find me," and "Lila." I felt an icy hand on my shoulder and turned around to find nothing there. My heart raced as the whispers continued, now almost pleading. Desperate to understand what was happening, I decided to consult Mrs. Hawkins. I visited her home the next day and explained the situation. She listened intently, her face growing more somber. "That doll," Mrs. Hawkins said, "was a gift to Emily from her grandmother. It said that the doll had a strange power, a connection to the spirit world. Emily's disappearance was never solved, but many believe she was taken by something beyond our understanding." She went on to tell me that Emily's parents had once been her neighbors, and she had witnessed their grief firsthand. Mrs. Hawkins had tried to investigate the doll years ago, but had been too frightened to continue. With this new information, I returned to the shop, determined to help. I decided to perform a ritual to communicate with the spirit trapped in the doll. I set up a circle of candles around it, lit incense, and began to speak softly, asking the spirit to reveal itself and guide me to the truth. As I chanted, the doll's eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. The whispers became a chorus of voices, rising to a crescendo. The room grew colder, and a shadow seemed to move in the periphery of my vision. Suddenly the doll's mouth opened, and a voice, not unlike a child's, spoke clearly. "Help me. I'm in the attic." I was startled but resolved to follow the lead. I checked the shop's attic, a place I had rarely visited. The space was cluttered with old furniture and forgotten items. As I searched, I found an old trunk hidden under a dusty sheet. The trunk was locked, but it had the same intricate carvings as the doll. I used a crowbar to force it open, and inside I found a collection of old letters, photographs, and Emily's personal belongings. Among them was a letter from Emily's parents, describing their daughter's fears of being taken by a dark presence. The trunk also contained a small locked box. Inside the box was a locket with Emily's picture and a final note from her grandmother, warning of a dark force that could trap souls within objects. The note was clear. "The doll holds a part of her soul. Free her by returning the doll to its rightful place." Following the instructions, I took the doll and the trunk to Emily's old home, which had been abandoned for years. I found the original location of Emily's room and placed the doll there, hoping to fulfill the request from the note. As I left the house, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The whispers had stopped and the air seemed lighter. When I returned to the shop, the eerie presence had vanished. The doll's eyes no longer followed me, and the shop returned to its usual state. Emily's story was no longer a mystery, and the doll was finally at peace. The antique shop felt different, less haunted, more serene. The whispers had ceased, and the chilling atmosphere had lifted. I learned that some antiques carry more than just their physical weight. They carry memories, emotions, and sometimes the echoes of souls trapped between worlds. The doll, once a source of fear, was now a reminder of the power of compassion and the importance of confronting the past to find closure. And though the whispers are gone, the story of the whispering doll remains a part of the shop's history, a testament to the lingering connections between the living and the lost.